Careful. Good afternoon, everyone. If you could please take your seats and silence your cell phones. For those of you standing at the back, you're welcome to stand, but across the hall in the salon, we have chairs set up and we'll be projecting this into that room. So that's an option. On behalf of Signal, I would like to welcome all of you to our 7th annual conference on Israel's China policy. If you want to social media the event, we ask that you use our hashtag Signal2022. And I would now like to invite to the stage our founder and executive director, Carice Whitty.
It's wonderful to see so many people standing room only. That's unusual for a China conference. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellency, Israel's ambassador to China, I understand you are on the line with us from Beijing. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you who are here in the room, and also those of you who have joined us from Asia, the Middle East, Europe, North America, Afghanistan, and of course, Israel. Some Israelis are online as well. One of the positive outcomes of all the suffering that we've been through with COVID is that the world learned how to connect in ways that we didn't know before. So thank you for joining Signal's 7th annual conference on Israel's China policy, which is our first major hybrid event. And those of you who have been with us over the past 7 years, and some of you have been very consistent in coming to our conference, you might note that there is an absence of the Chinese ambassador. Although he was on the program until about a week ago, unfortunately, we were informed that due to COVID restrictions and scheduling issues, he won't be able to speak. And the pandemic has created a massive effect on everything. The last time we met in such a large setting, we Signal, was 2019, and since then, the world has changed. In addition to COVID, there's also the war in Ukraine, but also a new US president, 2 Israeli governments, and the president of China attaining an unprecedented 3rd term. In some ways, things definitely got better. The Abraham Accords were forged, leading to an array of joint investment and people-to-people projects with Morocco, UAE, and Bahrain. In fact, the UAE-Israel Free Trade Agreement was completed in an unprecedented 4 months. On the other hand, the global stage is very much dominated by the intensification of the US-China rivalry, and this is reverberating throughout our region. Just 2 weeks ago, US officials made strong comments at the Manama Dialogue about China in the Middle East, and right now, President Xi is in Riyadh for the first time in 6 years. The US is facing a challenge to its global leadership from a nation that's 3 times its population. Under Xi Jinping, the military has been entirely revamped and repurposed to focus not only on domestic stability, which used to be the main role of the PLA, but to win wars, as we keep hearing from President Xi. Of course, we all want to win a war that we're in, but it's unusual for most countries to hear a major power stress publicly in times of peace to win a war. Meanwhile, in an effort to pursue a policy of common prosperity, something many countries would like to achieve, China's economy has taken a notable downturn. And those policies included things like reining in everything from real estate to after-school private education, which was almost completely wiped out, online platforms such as Jack Ma's Alibaba. This combined with the slowing global demand for Chinese exports and the COVID zero policy, and the spate of lockdowns has both depressed China's economy further and recently pushed citizens into the streets in ways that we haven't seen in recent memory. Perhaps that's why Xi's 3-hour conversation with Biden at the G20 last month focused on putting guardrails in place between these 2 powers. All of this might seem very far away from Israel, but actually it's on our doorstep, because at the heart of the rivalry is technology. For example, in early October, the US Department of Commerce instituted some of the most far-reaching restrictions aimed at limiting China's ability to access advanced computing chips. And like oil, without chips, most things don't run. Israel is a well-known tech and innovation powerhouse, but we go beyond that. Israel has just 0.1% of the world's population, but global investment in cybersecurity, 20% in Israel. And as for AI, their number of AI startups in this country is also at 20% of the world's total, eclipsing China and number 2 only to the United States. This is one of the reasons China is so interested in Israel. Whereas China is seeking technology from Israel, it is successfully installing tech in the rest of the Middle East. In fact, China has been the largest investor in the region since 2016. When China's Belt and Road investments diminished globally during the pandemic, they increased in the Middle East. China is now the leading trading partner with almost every country in the region. China's digital Silk Road has been very successful. Aside from Israel, China has installed 5G networks in most of the countries in the region. In addition to bringing its technology, China is also focused on access to critical infrastructure such as ports in the UAE, Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. China also proposed the Global Security Initiative, which speaks about a new security architecture in the Middle East. The US has taken note. While America remains the global military power and the security guarantor for the region, despite military withdrawals, we see Washington finding creative ways to engage economically with collaborations such as the novel idea of I2U2, Israel, India, UAE, USA. That cooperation has its first project slated to be food technology, where it's Israel Tech, UAE Money in India. Another outgrowth of creativity is the Abu Dhabi Israel Semiconductor Consortium, which plans to invest $3 billion in southern India to set up a chip fabrication plant. All of this brings us to the reason for this conference on Israel's China policy. As China evolves, so too must our approach to a policy. This requires that Israel strengthen its China expertise by ensuring that there are more China experts in government, research institutes, and think tanks. And to that end, Signal is extremely happy to have established the Goodman Family Research Fellowship in the field of China and China-Israel policy development. The fellowship will provide funding for study and research in Israel and abroad, and we look forward to awarding the first fellowship in 2023. We want to thank the Goodman Family Foundation for recognizing the importance to Israel of the connection between understanding China and a smart China policy. And of course, we want to thank the Goodman Family Foundation for their many years of support. Without further ado, I'd like to move to the first session and invite the Honorable David Schenker and Mr. George Cunningham to the stage for session 1, please. Can you hear? Oh, great. So let me begin. David is the Taub Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute and former US Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. And 2 years ago, he was the keynote speaker at this conference, which was 100% online. George is a former strategic advisor on Asia Pacific at the EU External Action Service and was instrumental in forming the EU-China strategy in 2016 and the Indo-Pacific strategy for the EU in 2021. This session is very close to my heart, a China policy. What would it take? There are many reasons why a China policy wasn't the focus for Israel over the past many years, and probably for other countries as well. China is a relatively new global player and new for Israel as a bilateral and notable regional player. And another reason is that there are many years where we really didn't have much to do with each other at all. Although we were the first country in the Middle East to recognize the PRC, they didn't return the formally reciprocate until 1992. And relations from 1992 were almost exclusively military sales and intelligence sharing with some agricultural technology thrown in. Until 2010, that relations began to broaden. So it is understandable that Israel, with all the challenges it faces, has informed a China policy that addresses China's unique characteristics. Because China is not the US and it is not Russia. It has a very different history, culture, and way of doing things. Chinese statecraft, unique unto itself. So a China policy would need to take into account these considerations. So we ask this question, what would it take? Because Israel's close relations with the US are very meaningful in our geopolitical landscape, some think we need a China policy to satisfy Washington. I would argue and have for many years that we need a China policy because China is an important actor for Israel and the Middle East and globally. And a well-crafted policy will strengthen Israel's position and the bilateral relationship. George has direct developing strategy, and he has done so for the EU. Tell me, George, how did that come about? The EU, so many countries, so complex.
Can you hear me? Not yet. Yes. Hello. Yes. Yes. Well, first of all, I just want to say how happy I am to see so many young people here. When I was young, once upon a time, I ran an organization called PACE International Affairs, which was educating youth amongst ourselves about international issues. And of course, this helped me through that knowledge to get here today. But also when I was in Afghanistan as Deputy EU Ambassador, we had a wonderful organization called the Youth Thinkers Society, which was really the generation of men and women coming from schooling, proper schooling, that were going to change Afghanistan. And regretfully now they're broken up. Some are in Canada, some are in the UK, and regretfully quite a number are in Afghanistan. But nonetheless, youth are the future, and I'm so happy to see you all here. So yeah, it's a complicated thing to do a strategy, especially within the European Union, because you have the bureaucracy you have to work with, of course. That's your own ministry. You have all the other ministries that need to be coordinated, and you have, of course, 27 member states. So it's not at all easy, but it is entirely possible given goodwill and good coordination. That's the key to the whole thing. So I was the deputy head of China division in 2012. And in 2014, President Xi came to Brussels for the one and only time. He was doing a grand tour. It was the beginning of his term, and he was trying to get a feel for everywhere, of course, before he would return to China and then direct the policy that we see today. And those days we were full of hope. I was in the meeting with President Van Rompuy that greeted him. We were full of hope that it would be a continuation and that we would see sort of further developments, positive developments, but quite the contrary happened. And many things in that time led us to, in 2016, produce our first EU-China strategy, which was a strategy largely of cooperation with China, looking at different areas specifically, and where the points are that we can cooperate, given the fact that we also were beginning to understand much more than ever before that market access was becoming a problem, that there was a lack of reciprocity, and there wasn't a level playing field. These are the sort of catchwords that we normally use. And unfortunately, by 2019, we updated that strategy with a 2019 strategic outlook. And by then, we'd had all the problems with Hong Kong. We had what was called the 16+1, the one being China, the 16 being Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans, where China was trying to basically enact what they call splitism, which is to take a part of the European Union and sort of have a separate relationship with that part of the European Union, obviously therefore messing up how the European Union itself actually functions. That was a big problem for us. Then we had, of course, COVID-19 and everything that happened that came from China, unfortunately, including not informing the international community there was a problem for 1 month and therefore allowing this virus to spread around the world. And then last but not least, Ukraine, more recently, of course, where you have the friendship without limits between Russia and China. And by then, the 16+1, which is Central and Eastern European countries and Western Balkans, had understood that China equals Russia, Russia equals China. And the formation is at the moment dissolving, and there are now 14 countries involved in the 16+1. Anyway, so we had to look at this. It becomes more and more complicated as time went on, the EU-China relationship, of course, because of the fact that you could not ignore China. It was very important. On the other hand, you had to put in safeguards, various safeguards concerning working with China, and also try to find pressure points where you can sort of push forward the agenda. And so we came up with a formula, a framework, in which we reminded people who were still in the framework of cooperating with China and only thinking in terms of cooperation and assuming there'd be reciprocity. Some of our ministries, if you like, were thinking that way, that we would regard China as a cooperation partner, a negotiating partner, or a competitor, or a strategic rival, depending on which sector we're actually dealing with. And we managed to embed this concept into all our ministries. That's very important in terms of communication. And therefore, we began to judge the situation. By the time European President Charles Michel went to China 2 weeks ago to meet with President Xi, I phoned Brussels and I said to them, well, how's the situation looking? They said more and more, unfortunately, systemic rival or competitor, basically, that the cooperation areas were diminishing very much indeed. I don't think, maybe I should finish at this point, but I'll come back on the areas of cooperation. But simply to say what's very important is good coordination, transparency, that all the ministries and all the departments know what everybody's doing, good communication with stakeholders, consultation with stakeholders, so a very thorough exercise. That's what's needed to create a strategy. Well, it would be, for instance, business, of course, very much affected. Here you have, obviously, various issues concerning business wanting to move ahead with the relationship with China, but various constraints. And then you have the issue of IPR protection, the issue of technology transfer. So when you go and you work in China, you're expected to transfer that technology to China. And whereas, you know, and rather... Sorry,
George, to interrupt, but not all IP is expected to be transferred. There's, we say in Hebrew, yesh v'yesh. There are some yes and some no. It's not a blanket issue.
But there is the edict, let's say, that if the Chinese insist on it, it shall be done.
But again, you have a choice. You don't have to go to the Chinese market. If you want to go to the Chinese market, then you should play by Chinese rules. Just like if you go to the US market, you have to deal with a whole set of different rules.
Well, not quite, because we are trying always for a level playing field, and we should expect back what we give, basically, in some form or another. And there you have the issue and the strategy between trade-offs, of course, and they can be in quite different areas. And I know that you're negotiating or coming to the end, perhaps, of an FTA negotiation with China. You have to look very, very carefully as to whether you have that reciprocity, maybe not in one particular sector, but in another sector, that there is a balanced relationship. That's what we're all striving for. So I can say more about this, but I think I've had my time. I just want to say so happy to see you all and look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
David has spent so much time in Israel and Middle East and is so familiar with it, and I think very familiar with the people, with the country, with the way we do things. David, can you please maybe focus us on what you think an Israel policy should achieve with respect to China?
Grace, thanks for inviting me. It's good to be with you. So what would a productive Israeli policy on China look like? Well, this is hard to define because to start off with, I mean, the United States doesn't even have in place an all-of-government comprehensive China policy. This was only recognized in the United States. I think during the Obama administration, we talked about the so-called pivot to Asia, but not really implemented until 2 years or so into the Trump administration, Secretary Pompeo, and a whole transformation about the U.S. approach to China. That, by the way, has been consistently adopted by the Biden administration. I think from now on will be the defining element of U.S. foreign policy in every administration going forward. But this policy itself hasn't been completely set. There's a couple ground rules for Israel. Like the United States, I think you were late in identifying the challenge posed by China.
Don't look at me.
You as a country were late, and maybe the United States was not explicit enough about how we viewed the nature of the problem. And this is important because, as I like to say, I think U.S.-Israel relationship will get past Ben Gvir. But if there's a problem on China, this could be a serious irritant to the bilateral
you're saying
relationship.
that Ben Gvir is going to be sort of something that might have to be balanced? The fact that we decided to vote for him, it's going to have to be balanced by China?
I'm saying
By giving up on?
no, not at all. What I'm saying is that this may be with the Biden administration. There may be some irritation here. I think you already had a speech from Secretary Blinken saying we will judge Israel. So let's put that aside. That's sort of tangential. China is an issue that is of such import to the United States that depending on how you handle it, that it could become an irritant in the relationship. And we've seen this before. I worked in the Pentagon from 2002 to 2006 when Israel decided to sell the Falcon, right, an AWACS system to China.
Wasn't that a time, sorry to interrupt, but just before they sold it before 2000, it went south in 2000. But wasn't it the US that wanted Israel to connect more with China in order to pull China away from the Soviet orbit in the 90s? It wasn't until the Berlin Wall fell that the Falcon became a problem, no?
There was a later understanding, perhaps a decade or 5 years after you signed the contract, that this was problematic, and yet you were compelled to cancel it and pay the fine. Then we had the Harpy, which was sold to China, which changed the cross-strait balance and made the U.S. commitment to Taiwan more difficult. And may cost the U.S. lives. Then there was the A-10 or Levy. The list goes on. It got so bad, you'll recall, and this was unprecedented, that the United States PNG'd.
You have to, what is that?
They made persona non grata the Director General of the Ministry of Defense of Israel, Amos Yaron. They said, you're no longer welcome to come to the Pentagon. This was during the Bush administration, which was one of the most pro-Israel Pentagons in American history. Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Donald Rumsfeld. It's a remarkable development. So we can put aside defense material, right? We understand that that's going to have to be limited.
And it's just for the record, Israel ever since has an airtight control on what is happening with the military, and nothing goes to China. Great.
That's the first step. So we are moving on to step number 2. And you heard about this when President Biden visited Israel. He announced, among other initiatives, that Israel and the United States would engage in a strategic technology dialogue, which the United States only has with 4 other countries. And this is going to be a highly detailed, granular discussion. By the way, the announcement did not mention China, but the implication is this is all about China.
Sorry, but isn't part of the purpose of that dialogue to bring Israel into more intensive R&D development and capitalize on the Israeli innovation capabilities and tech capabilities, and bringing it more towards the West? I mean, I hear what you're saying about China, but it wasn't the tech dialogue was not about criticizing Israel, right? It was opening opportunities.
Opening opportunities is one side. Also coming to a better mutual understanding about what the guardrails are here, about what you can do with a country that is been defined as the number one strategic challenge of the United States. And there are things like defense technology that are no-brainers. There are other things that are gray areas. And so you are a leader, as Chris said, in AI, in artificial intelligence, right? Not all artificial intelligence has military application. Some of it does. This is the future of the battlefield, and this is something that would be a problem. We haven't, and we shouldn't have to say, yes, you can sell this company. No, you can't sell that company. You should have a process and have a good understanding with Washington.
America should never want to do that with its allies, to
So-
go and tell them.
Well,
what
that's
to
right,
do.
because we have a mature relationship. We are partners. We are not dictating to Israel anything, but we have priorities. We have a global reach.
Would you
And-
say that China is an existential threat for, is that how the Washington is seeing? Like we look at it, or some of
Right.
us look at Iran, is that parallel for you?
But insofar as the United States is concerned about any power in the world, it is China.
So when we're talking about any aspect of Israel's China relationship, there's it sounds like, and we're starting to get the impression in Israel, not from only from this conference, that there's a black and white and not a gray, and that anything we do that connects to China might be subject to criticism by the U.S. So how do we square that circle? I mean, we're an independent nation that wants to advance our own interests, and there's a lot of value in the China relationship for Israel in many levels and many ways to do it without contradicting our national security, which is our number one interest. And of course, we take into consideration U.S. national security because, you know, we share the same values, and we appreciate the support and the cooperation between the two countries. So is it like a lack of trust that Israel doesn't doing that? What is it that makes the U.S. feel like it has to maybe step in?
Well, to have a dialogue on China will prevent misunderstandings on China. You know, until recently, I don't think Israel as a country understood exactly why the United States had concerns about China. And this is something I spent, you know, when I was in the government the last time, about 25% of my time as Assistant Secretary for Near East Affairs working on China-related issues. The number one issue here, it's not the human rights in China. It's not that China is perpetrating what the United States and the U.S. Museum of the Holocaust considered to be a genocide against the Uyghurs, the Chinese Muslims. It's essentially the assault on the global rules-based order. This is a strategic challenge to the United States and to all people in the world who like freedom. So the problem is, you know, that there's a Chinese lackey controlling WHO. And so when WHO goes to China to investigate the virus that was leaked from the lab in Wuhan, the WHO sits in Beijing for 3 or 4 months.
First of all, this isn't relevant for Israel's China policy.
No, it's totally relevant to your China policy about why you should see China as an actor being somewhat problematic. It's
being aware.
It's if China takes over another one of these UN-based organizations that is in charge of the internet and then starts to limit internet freedom, that's not great for Israel too. So I'm just trying to explain some of our concerns about China, and that may have some sort of resonance here.
George, I'd like to ask you, you mentioned all of government. What do you mean when you say an all of government approach, and why? Why does the whole government need to coordinate in a policy regarding China?
Sure, thank you very much indeed. Well, one of the first exercises that we did, and I'm from effectively the foreign ministry, is we did the mapping exercise of what actually is going on, because there are many ministries dealing with many different issues, and we found between 70 and 80 dialogues were taking place between China and the European Union a typical year, which means 1.5 dialogues a week. That was the intensity of the activity. in many different areas, some of which were overlapping. And therefore, of course, the problem that there becomes that what you can not get out of one ministry, you might be able to get out of another ministry. So there has to be a whole of government approach. It has to be, if you are to have a strategy, it has to have the person or the people in charge have to have authority, which means that in our case, it was the European Commission Secretariat General coordinating with the EEAS, which is the equivalent here of the Office of the Prime Minister coordinating with the Foreign Ministry. It may not be that configuration, but basically you need the Office of the Prime Minister to take the lead and to impose a bit of discipline, amongst various ministries with their own areas of competence and guarding them, to first of all have the transparency of what's going on. Also, it's useful from the mapping exercise to actually see where gaps might exist in thinking, comparing it, for instance, with the European Union mapping exercise. So, for instance, we have agriculture, we have food safety dialogues, and God knows what else. We have lots of connectivity dialogues with China. You name it, we pretty much do it. But perhaps, you look at our list and you say, oh, yes, these are the areas actually, you have it. And actually, that would be very useful for EU-China relations to have that dialogue. Now, talking about dialogues, we're talking about interministerial discussions that normally lead to some kind of agreement or MOU or whatever to further that relationship. So that's what I mean by whole of government approach, which is very important in terms of dealing with China, that likes a little bit to divide and rule, as indeed do many governments interacting with each other.
Thank you. The US sees India as a counterbalance to China. We have, as I mentioned earlier, the I2U2 cooperation. We are creating our own geoeconomic sphere with things like I2U2, Abraham Accords, the Negev Summit, the Eastern Med Gas Forum. How could that fit into a China strategy? David?
So I think alternative fora are useful potentially, but it's how they're operationalized. So this is a new device here, a new mechanism of really, I think, divergent fledgling partners. There are good relationships bilaterally between all, perhaps, but to create something that is an organization that can flourish and develop and have like a meaningful implication, I think we're really far away from that, and that's going to require an enormous amount of tending by the U.S. government and cooperation that all of these partners, UAE, India, Israel, United States, that we all find mutually beneficial for this thing to grow. Normally when you hear the announcement of a new organization, particularly being rolled out like on a Biden visit, these are called deliverables. And we have deliverables so that we can show that we're accomplishing things at international meetings, but they don't really necessarily mean anything. So let's see how it's operationalized.
George, do you want to weigh in on that, or do you?
I was going to actually just to continue a little bit what I was saying beforehand. May I do that?
Well, I would like
No.
I actually, let me tell you what I would really like to know. To what extent did your thinking when you were putting together that strategy take into consideration the United States?
Of course, it must. Of course, there were difficulties during the time of Trump, although cooperation continued between the European Union and the United States. But it was interesting that at the moment of the announcement of the election results, presidential election results, and even before the inauguration of President Biden, the European Commission had already had in its pocket and therefore came out with a whole approach, EU-US renewal approach, in the hope that things would improve in terms of the relationships, and indeed they have. As part of that came out the 2021 European Union Indo-Pacific strategy, which is not so much an anti-China strategy, not at all an anti-China strategy, but I would say is the EU's involvement in the Indo-Pacific, because France, for instance, is an Indo-Pacific power with Pacific bases and so on, not to be forgotten, but it was to do with diversification. The whole theme of this Indo-Pacific strategy was to say, look, there's lots of
Wait, I
interesting
just I
countries.
just want to say for our audience,
Yes.
there's no word in Hebrew for Indo-Pacific. So maybe you could just clarify what
Okay.
Indo-Pacific. תודה. נדסקס את זה.
Indo-Pacific is a term that was first used by Japan to define its role in the region. It has implications that this is an anti-China thing. However, ASEAN produced an Indo-Pacific approach, just the using of the word Indo-Pacific.
ASEAN, you want to
ASEAN
say-
is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which is a 10-member organization, which has hopes for the future a bit of becoming like a European Union, but is far from it at this stage. Anyway, they produced an Indo-Pacific strategy, but there you have countries that are beholden to China. So therefore it became easier for other countries to have Indo-Pacific and to say basically it's not anti-China, but it's our involvement in the region. And the region is defined in different ways a little bit, but for EU it is Western Indian Ocean up to the Pacific Islands.
how does this connect to the US, taking into consideration the
Yes.
US
Thank
when
you.
you're doing a policy?
Yes, the thing is that the US was very keen on the European Union to join it, basically, not to join it in the sense of an alliance or anything like that, but to have the presence of the European Union in the Indo-Pacific. And of course, it was an issue for us because we have our issues with Russia that was not as clear as it is now where it went, but many of our member states
is that
wish
something
to
that
be.
Israel could, does the Indo-Pacific, because the Indian Ocean sort of flows up into the Red Sea,
Yes.
and we are actually part of it in our own small way. Does the Indo-Pacific have a connection here, or can you put it back to the US?
Well, it would be an interesting idea. Well, one of the issues that we've been discussing earlier on is with the perception that the United States is moving out of, or is a misperception, entire misperception, somehow the US is lessening its links with the Middle East. It's entirely wrong, but it's a perception that needs to be countered. So one of the discussions and think tank ideas that people were having was to extend the concept of the Indo-Pacific for the United States. For instance, for the United States to declare that the Middle East is part of its Indo-Pacific strategy. It's just an idea, probably won't happen, but it's one of those concepts that came out. It's a simple way of communicating to the world the importance of the Middle East, continuing importance of the Middle East.
Well, I agree that the Middle East remains critically important to America, but I'm not too sure that any of the countries in the region would want to be labeled as part of the Indo-Pacific. Might be good for us, but I think a lot of research has to be done on that. David, when you're talking to Israelis, which you've had an opportunity to do in the last few days about our China relationship, your China relationship, first of all, I do want to say that it's a new world in that China is so much on everybody's radar. We at Signal, we've been trying to encourage people to pay attention to China, understand China, learn about China for years and years. And it's very, it's too bad that it is in the context of a global power, great power rivalry. But on the other hand, it's really great that it gets people interested in learning about this incredibly important player. So when you were talking to these different sectors of the Israeli community, business, government, third sector, what did you feel was their biggest concern with respect to China and how to think about China?
Well, I think, first of all, look at the crowd today, people that are sitting around for 3 hours to listen to a bunch of people talk about China. I couldn't imagine 3-4 years ago this happened. Not because your organization is not doing great work, but because it wasn't really on the radar screen. I came here as a secretary maybe 3 years ago, and I talked at the INSS conference. I talked about China. I think people's eyes glassed over. What are you talking about? So it's an issue, and it's on the radar screens, I think, everywhere from the ministries to the business community. And I was really impressed that they're about the growing appreciation for maybe not for the nature entirely of the problem, but for the level of concern in Washington about the problem. And okay, I wish it was the other way, but that's not important. I think as long as we have an understanding about how the United States sees this, I think among the business community, I think there's a real concern that that the United States will somehow prevail upon Israel to adopt CFIUS, the sort of regime for technology control or economic dealings with China, which I think the business community here would consider to be draconian and probably compel an exodus of Israeli software engineers to Cyprus, right? So putting that aside, I think there's a recognition that something has to be done. And I'm glad that there is a willingness to engage in a discussion, a dialogue about what this means and how to move forward together with your principal ally and our best partner in the Middle East.
George, what was the response of all these different sectors of government that you and your team were talking to? Were they responsive? Were they open to cooperation? Did they want to work together? Was that heavy lifting, or were you walking through an open door?
As I said, it has to come. The direction has to come from the top, from the Prime Minister, basically in this particular case, to give directions ready for this coordination to take place. Otherwise, ministries will tend to drift apart. Also, we had the equivalent of our foreign ministry sitting in many of the dialogues, so that we kept track what everybody was doing. We weren't imposing our will necessarily on the ministries, but we were just, light touch, checking what was going on and having that discussion before the dialogue occurs. So these were methods in which we could work together and succeed. But I should say one or two other things, if I may. One is that we started as the European Union with having a global strategy. We first of all assessed on a global level where the European Union wanted to be, what kind of system it wanted to be. For instance, we want to have one world system. We don't want to have, two world systems developing, and that kind of level of working out, and where our best interests lies, and who are our allies, and things like that. That will be the equivalent for you.
Very important points, but because the EU is so large relative to Israel, I mean, you're many countries together, and many of those countries are much bigger than Israel. So a global strategy, first of all, there is no strategy, as far as I know, in Israel. I'm also told there's no word in Hebrew for strategy, estrategia, also, not a native word. So it sounds ideal. I'm not sure how applicable that is here. I want to ask you, David, when you're talking to other countries in the region, are you getting the same kind of feedback? Are they happy to be on board? What I understand is that the UAE rejected the F-35s that they were planning to get from the US because they would not extricate Huawei networks from their system. They stood their ground and they were willing to pay a price, and they want to do business with China.
Oh, listen, it's in the Gulf. The Gulf's number one trade partner is China. Right? They're selling oil for Saudi Arabia, for the UAE. It's China. They don't want to alienate or otherwise irritate their leading trade partner. This is an important relationship. This is also part, now that we are in sort of a multipolar world, part of a hedging strategy, that they want to have good relations with everyone. Some countries more than others are doing things strategically with China. You can read about it in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, what they're doing. For the UAE, they were promised, as you correctly pointed out, the MQ-9, a very large, very effective killer drone. And they were also promised the F-35 in return, the Joint Strike Fighter, for making peace with you, part of the Abraham Accords. And then we went to a review. And just so happens that the F-35 operates on 5G. And the integrity of the airplane, the security of the system is dependent on not having Huawei communication backbone, which effectively would compromise the airplane.
I understand.
Yeah, they made a choice, and maybe didn't want the F-35 that much,
Yeah.
but they made a choice. But every NATO partner that has the F-35 doesn't have Huawei.
So I want to thank our speakers, and I want to thank all of you for your patience and your interest, and we will move on to the next session.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we may, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us for this second session. Since we have media people with us joining us, we'll do this a bit briefer than with policy wonks or academics, because media people, like me, are used to a more, how would I say it, quick pace, to the point. You can ask directly.
We got your message.
I wasn't going there, but that doesn't matter. The reason we asked you to join us this afternoon is for a very simple reason, because Israeli officials don't want to be here on the stage, not senior officials, not politicians. They don't want to talk about China, let alone China, United States. So we asked you to come so that you can enlighten us, perhaps, to what they think about the China policy issue, about the US-China relationship, and why are they so timid? Lahav, you want to go first?
Sure. The very short answer is that they don't think about it enough. I think people sort of got that from David's comments in the previous panel, but Israeli government officials, they just don't think about it as much as they ought to, and the U.S. has been, trying to explain to them that they need to change for a few years now. But overall, Israel wants the economic benefits of partnership and cooperation with China without having to deal with the broader implications, whether it has to do with the US-Israel relationship or other matters that are important to national security. And so they've sort of been reticent. And I think it was true under Netanyahu. It was true under the government we had for the last year and a half. It really didn't. There, not big changes from one to the other. And so certainly there's no public statement of a China policy. Instead, it's mostly Israel quietly trying to do things to not anger the US and also to protect its security, its data security, cyber security, things like that. Like in things like when Chinese companies bid on a major infrastructure tender that could be an issue for various reasons, and then the Chinese company won't win the tender, even though they might be giving the lowest price, and then Israel will, whichever ministry it is, communications ministry, transportation ministry, they'll have real reasons for it, right? But at the same time, unofficially, there's also national security considerations. So it's like a quiet China policy.
It's a quiet one. But Barack, over the past year, Israel for the first time, actually twice, joined an international statement expressing its grave concerns over what is happening in the Xinjiang region. What happened
Which statements do you refer to?
at the United Nations?
Yeah, but which ones? You mentioned twice, right?
Twice, yes. I know.
Which is the last one that you
I
referred
heard
to?
there's another one coming up.
So there were 3 times. Just a few days ago, Israel joined
I don't know what it
another
is.
statement, the UN, that was led by Canada, to condemn the terrible human rights violations in Xinjiang. And I think that David is here, and I'm old enough to remember how during the
You're
Trump.
not old.
Well, I'm getting there. How during the Trump administration, David and his boss Pompeo, Secretary of State, and President of the United States himself, pressed the Israeli government to change its policy towards China. The Netanyahu government, again during the Trump administration, made its best effort to drag its feet. Eventually passed this half tea, half coffee decision on a monitoring mechanism on foreign investments that had no teeth at all, and basically made every effort possible not to do anything. And more than everything, it did not, the Netanyahu government that ended its term in 2021, during all of Netanyahu's years, the Israeli government did not look at China as a national security issue. It looked at it only as an economic issue, okay? And I think that this has changed during the outgoing government's term. For the first time, officially, Israel started referring to China as a national security issue. There were several meaningful steps that the Israeli government has taken. First, again, changing the baseline for the policy of looking at it as a national security issue. And second, the last security cabinet decision this government has taken was about turning the foreign investment monitoring mechanism to something real. And it was quite, again, I don't know if anybody referred to this in previous panels or not. Okay, I'll just give you a few examples for what this monitoring mechanism means. Any foreign investment of above 20% in a company needs to be approved by a committee, and it's not voluntary, it is compulsory. That's first. Second, in some foreign investments in companies in certain fields, you only need 5% of foreign investment in order to go to the review process. Only 5%. And for the first time, the foreign ministry is not only an observer in this committee, but it is a member. Those are steps that, again, might sound very wonky and technical for a lot of people, but this, again, you can ask David afterwards, because those are the things that he wanted for many, many years. And it happened during the outgoing government. And this was a very significant decision. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a U.S.-Israel economic talks, 2 or 3 weeks ago. And this issue of foreign investments, and it's always like the code name, foreign investment, relations with China, that's the bottom line. This was the first issue on the agenda. The first issue, okay? And I'm telling you because I saw the cables. First issue on the agenda, okay? And they passed this cabinet decision so that they'll be able to tell the Americans in those talks that it's done, okay? And Israel and the US had around 2 months ago, first strategic dialogue on technology, okay? One of the preconditions for holding this this dialogue was that there will be a working group established to deal with protection of technology, monitoring foreign investments. Again, all the code
They
names for
called it
China.
risk management, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So I think that the last government changed a lot when it comes to China, and it's very good that they did. But I'll tell you something even more interesting. Even more interesting, because Netanyahu, he was the father of the strategy of honeymoon with China. Okay, he went to China. He passed a special government decision on boosting ties with China, boosting investments, and basically getting us to where we are today, and getting us into trouble. And the same Netanyahu, a few days ago, gave an interview to a reporter called, a columnist called Barry Weiss. And the headlines from the interview was what he said about Trump and Kanye, okay? Those were the headlines and, about the government. But inside, there was a very interesting line, which everyone who's interested in this triangle of US, China, Israel must read this line. And he said that at first he gave him a broader point of the fact that Israel, at the end of the day, is in the camp of the Western liberal democracies. And then he went and started talking about China from that baseline. And he said that for many, many years, again, I'm paraphrasing, for many, many years, Israel looked at China only through an economic lens. And now he said, and things changed. And now I understand that we need to look at China through a national security lens too, and take care of our national security interests. For Netanyahu, this is I'm just finishing my point. So, and for Netanyahu, this is an earthquake. That's the person that for 15 years went this way on China, and then all of a sudden now he's moving that way. So it's very interesting. And I think that when you look at the incoming government, you have to read those lines because they will signal where Israel is going.
Just to add to your point, if I remember correctly, he was not asked about China. He was asked, I think, about Turkey and Erdogan, and he brought up China himself, which just goes to show that he wasn't just trying to, go along with what the interview wants him to talk about, but actually thinks that this is an important issue, an important change that Israel's made in looking at China.
Yeah, I need that from time to time. So what explains this transformation? Is this only about US pressure, or is there some internalization? Because, Bach said something about national security. What does that mean? I know what, let me put it for the audience. When you say Iran is a national security concern for Israel, we all get it. When you say it's about China, what do you mean? Love, Barak?
So, look, it's not as direct in terms of, Iran, where their leaders talk about Israel being, like a cancer that needs to be extracted from the region. But, China has been known to use its ties, whether it's physical presence or just its relations with other countries, to put inordinate pressure on those countries for espionage and things like that. So there is the direct element, but there's also sort of the broad geopolitical element where, Israel is overall aligned with the West, and in all likelihood will continue and wants to continue to be aligned with the West. And there's this sort of split, this reorganization going on in the world. And Israel has to think sort of more broadly about where it wants to be, which countries will have Israel's interests in mind in the long term, which countries share values with Israel. I think, Israel's sort of going through a process of thinking about its values and what they are, but they're certainly, even the new government, whatever people think of the new government, it's not the values of China necessarily, and China is aligned with countries that not only don't have Israel's best interest in heart, but, are actively hostile to Israel, including Iran, for example, that they've signed some sort of long-term defense partnership. I know that there's frustration in Iran that that's not necessarily going as swimmingly as they wanted. But it's just not, these are things that Israel looks at with concern, and that, that China's not a country that Israel's going to depend on. So if the US, it's not all about US pressure, right? The US pressure comes from something. There's actually something going on in the world that Israel needs to be aware of and cautious about. But I think also the US pressure emphasizes for Israel sort of where Israel needs to stand in all of this. And it's been a slow recognition, but it's happening.
Barak, you have reported rather extensively, more in English, by the way, than in Hebrew, because you report for Axios and for Walla.
No, and it's because nobody cares about this here. That's no, seriously. It's and the good thing when in the age of digital media is that you can see very clearly how many people care about this in Hebrew and how many people care about this in English. And in English, not only in absolute numbers, but even like relatively much more.
That's the point. Now, but let's move on for 1 second, because in Axios, I think yesterday you reported about the visit of President Xi to Saudi Arabia and about the upcoming summit between China and the Arab world. Does this trigger even an interest in Israel, in Jerusalem? Are we somewhat concerned or happy, blessing, endorsing, or careless?
I would want to say that people care. I'm not sure, at least not people that matter. And unfortunately, I don't think that this will change in the immediate future. I think, it's again, no offense to anybody, but it's just you saw how she was welcomed in Saudi Arabia with the fighter jets flying next to his government plane and the cannons at the airport and the ministers, Saudi ministers waiting for him, and the number of Arab leaders who are going to be there. And you remember how Biden was welcomed in Saudi Arabia. Anybody knows who came to see Biden at the airport? The governor of the Jeddah governorate. That's it. Okay. And there were no cannons and no planes and no nothing. And I think this is, so you can say, well, it's the Middle East. It's just, all those theatrics, but it matters. It matters. It's not just, theatrics. I mean, this symbolism matters and it shows something. And I think that there's a big problem. And when she comes to the region and the US response to this is sending 2 deputy assistant secretaries to 3 countries to say something about China, I think it's a problem. I think it's a problem.
Could you elaborate? Because I'm not sure most of the people know who you're talking about.
The people who were here in this conference.
No, all right.
Yeah, but they were here at this conference. I mean, this is the U.S. response to a 4-day visit by the president of China with 3 summits with 20-something Arab leaders, with multi-billion-dollar deals with the Arab world, with crazy discussions about Chinese assistance to the Saudi nuclear program. This is, this is some, serious stuff. And just 2 weeks ago, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy was in a conference, and Tommy, you were there, a conference in Bahrain, saying you can't, basically saying, it's either, he said it's not either our way or the highway. Or basically, he said that it is, okay. And 2 weeks later, basically the region tells them, you know what? It's the highway, you know, and it's a problem.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with you on the analysis, but we'll leave it to that point. But I want to ask Lahav, but it's fine. We don't always have to agree on the analysis. But Lahav, why does this not trigger interest in Israel, in Jerusalem? Is it triggering any interest? You know, I'm not talking about, you know, I'm sure the people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I know, are following the issue and analyzing it. But when it comes up to, what I say, members of the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, when it comes up to ministers, deputy ministers, whatever, dealing with foreign relations and whatever, are they concerned about the welcoming reception for President Xi in Riyadh?
This is not going to be a very satisfying answer because it's an answer to many questions about Israel. But you know, there's that famous Kissinger quote that Israel doesn't have foreign policy, Israel only has domestic policy. And I think that goes even more so for the period that we're in right now, where we just had an election, the government's being formed, the prime minister's interest in being prime minister is waning. I mean, he'd really love to remain prime minister for sure, but now that he's not going to, his interest is waning. And it's just, it's just like not on anyone's list as far as I can tell, outside of the people in the foreign ministry whose job it is to be, you know, China watchers and Saudi Arabia watchers. I'd like to say that under more normal or stable circumstances, when we're not in this sort of interim government period, it would be better, but it's not that much better. I mean, it's just the recognition, with all due respect to the security cabinet decision and to things Netanyahu said to Barry Weiss, so far, it's just not been high on the government's priorities. Not as high as I think it should be, certainly, but just low, pretty low in general. And you could probably attribute that to the fact that most Israelis are just not that interested in it. It's not something that the public, you know, gets worked up about. It doesn't get you any votes.
But another reason why it should be important, and by the way, when it comes to the people who do think it's important, we all need to thank the former head of Shin Bet, Nadav Argaman, who was the first one in this country who raised the flag about China and stopped this very, very dangerous deal with this insurance company. And we all need to thank him for that. And I think that there's another layer of what's going on, and hopefully people will start noticing. Check out things like twin city agreements, okay, between Israel and China. And you'll see something very interesting. You'll see that many of those twin city agreements are in cities that the mayor is from the Likud. Okay, and it's in Ashdod as an example. Okay, in Ashkelon, and those are things that, again, it's like it's in many countries that's an MO of the Chinese Communist Party of trying to get influence through the municipalities, through, again, very very soft, in a very soft way. And I think that there's, I mean, again, this thing needs to be, looked at much more closely. But again, at least to me, it seems that, the Likud is, a target for influence for the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's a matter for concern, especially because, as we discussed, our politicians know nothing about this. Okay, and they don't care, and they're not gonna all of a sudden gonna get educated about this. Okay, so they are very much exposed to those kind of influence attempts, and I think it's very, very dangerous.
Okay. We'll soon be hearing from the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State from Washington. But I want to ask you, because we have to start moving towards wrap up. What next? And that's the question. And the what next has two connections, because if up until now the US government was more concerned about what is coming into Israel, it's starting to be more concerned, it seems, and this is, and Barak alluded to it when he talked about the high tech, the US government might become more concerned about what is going out, not what is coming in, but also what is going out. And when you tie this in also with Netanyahu's statement, what will we see in the coming, well, a term of the government? Will we see a foreign minister or high-level officials that are more informed about China, more concerned about or more engaged about China's role in the Middle East? What can we expect? Love?
Look, if you're asking what's next, what should be next is that they should implement the cabinet's decision. There are unfortunately piles and piles of decisions made that don't get implemented. If it's in the security cabinet, it has a better chance. I mean, it was in the security cabinet. So, that's the first thing, right? I think a lot of the US concern about what's going on in Israel has to do with the high tech sector. And this is about investments in the high tech sector. And that would be a major step if Israel were really to do all those things in the decision. Beyond that, in terms of people making decisions in Israel, as we've said more than once, that they don't really know about this issue. They don't really know what's going on. I don't remember we're not sure who's going to be foreign minister, but, I don't remember the candidates that being particularly big on this issue. Barak's been diplomatic reporter longer than me. Maybe he knows of something. And so it's hard to say what's next, right? In terms of who's going to be in charge of the economic issues in Israel, there are also people who are not particularly interested in foreign affairs and foreign policy, except for where it pertains to Palestinians, I guess. I don't know if that's the line between foreign and not foreign, I guess. So it's hard. This government is the foreign policy is going to be very much dominated by Netanyahu because he has, the other parties in his coalition are not particularly interested in these issues. And it's going to be up to him. He's going to have to decide whether he wants to actually implement what the previous government did, whether he actually wants to do what he said he's going to do, or act on the realization he said he had.
I think that in the next government, the key individual is going to be Ron Dermer on foreign policy. I don't think he's going to be the foreign minister. I think he'll be some sort of a
special envoy.
I don't even know how to describe this. He'll be, a satellite that will, but he'll be in charge of the important stuff. Okay. And
is China going to be on that list?
China is going to be on that list because the US will be on that list. That's the angle. Okay. And Ron Dermer, I think, understands fully how China today is a bipartisan issue in the US. It's not, it's not like, if we have problems with, we don't want to do stuff with China and the administration is, Democrats will go to the Republicans. No, the Republicans are even, again, in some fields are much more hardline than Democrats. In some fields, it's the other way around. But, there's I think one of the biggest decisions that the government will have to take on China in the next term is the free trade agreement. That's a big thing. A big thing. You want to tell me that the US would want to see a free trade agreement between Israel and China? No way. No way. You think Republicans in Congress would want to see a free trade agreement between Israel and China? They don't. They don't. And people here, I think, will be aware. Okay. So this is, and this is the next big decision. Okay, the free trade agreement. So I think that this is where it's going. And if Israel doesn't sign a free trade agreement with China, I think it's a message towards China also. And, so we are very close to a watershed moment of this, that Israel will, for the first time, will really have to choose where it stands.
But let me press you on this point a bit more, if I may. Because, when you talk about the free trade agreement, which was supposed to be also including investments, and it won't probably include investments, it's going to be a very, how I say it, thin, perhaps. Will it still make
It's going to be very thin because it's not going to be.
All right, that's a fair thing. But I want to make your lives a bit more complicated. And speculating, of course, we're allowed to speculate. The next government will probably likely have some contentious issues. I believe that David mentioned in the last session, Mr. Ben-Gvir, there'll be issues coming up to the government. And to the US administration, I'm sure there'll be some disagreements, let's put it this way. How will the China factor figure in here? Will it be a card that the Netanyahu government will play with? Will it be enough to, for instance, paper over or ease contentions with the US administration over settlement policy?
No, I mean, this question I think came up in the last panel as well, and I don't think so. I really, I mean, they're not stupid in the Biden administration. They don't think like, oh, somehow that China covers for the Palestinians. They can and they do push Israel on multiple issues at the same time. And so it is true, like in diplomacy, there's, give and take. And I think the US shouldn't expect Israel to always have the exact same position as the US on everything. But, I don't see a reality in which this is some sort of like zero-sum game where the US is going to say, Israel can only give up X amount and it should be in this pile, not this pile.
We have to end, but so I'll give you so Netanyahu will not play with the China factor?
Again, it doesn't have to be a deal, okay? But when you have 10 issues, you come to a meeting with the President of the United States, okay? You have 10 issues on the table. On at least 5, you need to say no to the President, okay? So you need to make sure that the other 5 are things that you can say yes. And, China is an issue that is much easier to say yes to the president than settlements, than Iran, than, other stuff. So I think that at the end of the day, I agree, there's not going to be like a deal because the administration is not stupid. But when Netanyahu comes to that meeting, he'll look for issues where he can say yes to the president. And China is one of those issues.
I want to thank you both. Lav Halkov, the senior contributing editor, diplomatic correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, and Barak Avi, the diplomatic correspondent at Walla News and Access, Middle East commentator. Thank you both for coming. And we'll be over soon. I hand over the reins to Kalish Peter, please.
Friends around the world say, why is the US-China rivalry the subject of a conference on Israel's China policy? I think you can start to get a sense of why. The US does loom large. I want to thank Lahav and Barak and Tommy for a very, very interesting discussion. But now it is my honor to introduce the keynote speaker, Dr. Jung Pak, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multilateral Affairs and Global China Issues, as well as the Deputy Special Representative for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the DPRK, at the US State Department. Dr. Pak is a former senior fellow of the Brookings Institute and a former intelligence officer of the Central Intelligence Agency, and previously served as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for North Korea at the National Intelligence Council. And during her visit this summer to Israel, I had the great pleasure of meeting Dr. Pak and exchanging ideas on China policy in the Middle East. We are very, very privileged to have you with us today to deliver the conference keynote address. Dr. Pak.
Carice, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And it's great to see you, and I wish I could be there in person. Friends and colleagues, it is an honor to join you at the Signal conference today. Special thanks to Signal Executive Director Carice Witt and others for their generous hospitality. The participation of so many distinguished professionals in this conference is a clear testament to the role that Signal plays in Israel's national security discourse. And thank you for allowing me to be a part of that conversation. The US-Israeli partnership is strong, endearing, and multifaceted. It is based on shared interests and shared values. And thanks to this close relationship, Israel continues to be a trusted partner when tackling new and emerging challenges, not only in the region, but around the world. No challenge is more urgent than preserving the rules-based international system, because that system has provided the predictability and stability necessary to meet the other challenges we face. And let's face it, there have been a slew of global challenges over the past several years, which has shown us that we are all connected and that we're all in this together. Of course, I'm talking about the pandemic. I'm talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has exacerbated food and energy security issues. I'm talking about climate change. So that's why we need the international rules-based international system, because it protects our citizens by bolstering national, regional, and global security, and really reinforces the reasons why we need to work together. It secures the global supply chains that support our businesses and economies, and it reflects the values that guarantees our freedoms. The Middle East is critical to the international rules-based order and has an important role to play. And let me just point out here that this is not just about the US-Israeli ties or US ties to the region, but the United States as a whole invested more in the region in 2021 than the next 6 biggest investor countries combined, a strong testament to the US private sector. A little bit of the conversation before me, MENA region was less than half of that of the other region for the political security and the work with partners and allies like Israel further and build a sustainable, comprehensive US partnership in the region. One of those challenges is the People's Republic of China and its problematic activities. As clearly laid out in President Biden's national security strategy, the United States sees the PRC as the greatest geopolitical challenge that we face, because it is the only competitor with both the intent to reshape and remake the international order, and increasingly the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological capability to do so. We recognize the way the United States and the PRC manage our relationship in the coming years will have significant consequences for the entire world. Consequently, we remain committed to developing common sense guardrails to bound the competition, especially as the PRC has become more repressive domestically and more aggressive abroad in challenging the interests and values of the United States and our allies and partners. President Biden upheld this commitment to managing the competition at his November 14th meeting with PRC President Xi Jinping on the margins of the G20 meeting in Bali. The two leaders had an open and candid conversation about their intentions and priorities that began to build the floor for the US PRC relationship going forward. As part of our ongoing effort to responsibly manage this relationship and to ensure our competition does not veer into unintended conflict, we are committed to keeping multiple channels of communication open with Beijing, and we will continue to pursue our invest, align, and compete strategy, which Secretary of State Tony Blinken laid out in his May 26th speech. And let me go into some aspects of that speech. One, we will invest in the foundations of our strength at home. Two, we will align with partners and allies on our approach abroad. And by harnessing these two key assets, we will, three, compete with the PRC to defend our interests and build our vision for the future. On the first point, we have invested at home. The Biden administration has delivered on major investments in infrastructure, education, basic science research, and human capital, as well as efforts to bolster supply chain security and resiliency. Two, we have aligned with allies and partners abroad. And Carice mentioned my visit earlier in the summer this year to Israel and to the region. I see that as a key part of my job. We will demonstrate our determination to continue to work with allies and partners to address this challenge and to keep their interests at heart. The United States is not pursuing a policy to decouple China's economy from our or from the global economy. We do not seek to contain or inhibit China's legitimate development goals or market-based industry or trade. Instead, we are engaging with our allies and partners, including Israel, to ensure that the PRC plays by the same rules as everyone else. We will continue to uphold and revitalize the international system in a way that protects the values, the principles, and rules that have led to peace and prosperity for so many across the globe for decades, indeed for all of us. But competition with Beijing will not preclude cooperation in areas where our interests intersect. We will welcome the PRC's cooperation on issues such as climate change, health security, counter-narcotics, arms control, and non-proliferation. The very issues that directly threaten our prosperity and security. That is what the international community expects. A key objective of our international rules-based system is to create and maintain the conditions that enable our economies to flourish through global commerce. I mentioned the level of US investment in the region when I first spoke with you. We do not wish for Israel or any country to decouple its economy from China's. In fact, our relationship with China is very complicated. And as you've heard the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, mention a couple of weeks ago, we want to promote trade and investment that do not, in areas that do not threaten our core economic and national security interests or human rights values. And we do not wish for Israel or any country to decouple its economy from China's. However, we must be clear-eyed about the serious national security risks. The panel before, I mentioned technology. In that sector, for example, the Chinese Communist Party leaders have been explicit about their objectives. They have set forth an ambitious national strategy which seeks to break down all barriers between the civilian and military technological spheres by, quote, fusing the defense and civilian industrial bases through what the PRC officials call military-civil fusion. The PRC has entered Israel's thriving high-tech companies through technology transfer and talent recruitment programs. The PRC state-owned enterprises are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into civilian, emerging, and critical technologies with dual-use capabilities, including but not limited to artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and robotics. On science and technology cooperation between Israel and the United States, our close relationship is based on certain fundamental scientific values and norms. But as we know, these principles do not prevail everywhere. To the contrary, they have often been exploited for unfair gains and for illiberal uses by the PRC. This may occur through legitimate means, such as joint research and development with foreign firms, or through collaboration with foreign universities. But it also occurs illicitly through theft and cyber espionage and espionage. We would like to see all of our partners in the international community raise awareness of these challenges, assess their own risks and vulnerabilities, and develop risk mitigation measures. We know that Israel is attuned to the potential risks of PRC investment, especially in the fields of infrastructure and technology. With its investment screening mechanism, Israel has started the process of ensuring that foreign investment does not run afoul of Israeli national security interests. This is a step in the right direction, and we would like to see more action to protect Israel's advanced innovation in critical and emerging technologies. In September, the US and Israel launched the high-level strategic dialogue on technology to discuss issues, including protections for these critical and emerging technologies to create trusted technology ecosystems. We will also continue to share our lessons learned from the evolution of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, or CFIUS, and offer technical assistance as Israel's Oversight Committee develops to meet the needs of its unique operating environment. Ultimately, close cooperation in foreign investment risk management is part of our ongoing work on protecting key technologies while promoting relationships between the United States and Israel on innovative tech. Which just brings us back to the importance of preserving the international rules-based system and the commercial norms that help us protect shipping lanes, emerging technologies, and semiconductor supply chains. I talked earlier about the aggressiveness of Beijing's coercive activities and its more assertive military behavior. The PRC seeks to erode the status quo in the Taiwan Strait through its provocative behavior. Although Taiwan may seem far away, what happens there directly affects us all and our respective economies. Almost half of the global container fleet transits through the Taiwan Strait, and over 92% of leading edge semiconductor chips and more than 50% of the globe's total semiconductor chips are manufactured in Taiwan. Peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait matters to us all, including to high-tech economies like Israel. As the Biden administration continues to reaffirm, we are committed to our One China policy. This status quo has served the world well for decades, and it is in all of our interests to see global prosperity continue to flourish through peaceful and stable Taiwan Strait. Remaining committed to our One China policy means we oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side, including Taiwan independence. To be clear, we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means, since the global economic impact of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait will affect countries across the globe. Finally, standing up for the rules-based international order also ensures that we continue to protect and promote the human rights and dignity of all people based on our shared commitment to universal principles and values. Last month in the United Nations Third Committee, Israel stood up for human rights and signed onto Canada's statement condemning the PRC's atrocities in Xinjiang. We welcome opportunities to continue to work together on Xinjiang and other human rights issues of concern for the region in the future, as we remain committed to promoting human rights throughout the globe. To conclude, Israel has been an important partner for the United States in tackling regional and global challenges. With the PRC posing an increasingly thorny challenge to the international system that has served as the bedrock of our shared freedoms, prosperity, and security for decades, we look forward to working together to meet this and future challenges. I look forward to a robust exchange of ideas throughout the conference and well into the future on the PRC in the Middle East and how we can continue to bolster the US-Israel partnership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Assistant Secretary Dr. Pak. Without further ado, I wish to invite Ambassador Gold and Ms. Bonnie Glick to the stage so that we can start our next session, please. I want to welcome from afar and at a rather late hour, I have to add, Dr. Zhao Hai and Mr. James Crabtree were joining our session. Yes, hi James, and Dr. Zhao from Beijing.
Hi there.
Hello. I apologize in advance for Dr. Zhao. He will remain with his video closed because he is still recovering from COVID. We wish him well and a speedy recovery. And we thank him particularly for joining us despite this. And welcome to this session, which we have titled, we've chosen to title it in a rather provocative way, Aligning, Maneuvering, or Squirming, US allies and partners amid the great power rivalry. And our thinking about this session is very straightforward and very simple. It's, we've been talking about this triangular relationship, if you wish, US-China rivalry and how it affects Israel. But the point is that this rivalry and this competition also affects other US allies and partners around the world. And it also has it is not only a relationship that is affected by the United States, but also by China and China's actions. So we want to bring into this mix a more broader discussion about US allies and partners vis-a-vis this relationship between China and the United States. And allow me to start with turning to Bonnie Glick, the former COO, if you wish, of the USAID, and a woman with an established career in diplomacy, in business. What are the US expectations of its allies and partners? Perhaps we should be frank about this, or honest. You would prefer Soviet-style satellites rather than opinionated allies and partners, right? Or do you actually prefer allies with some sort of agency?
Hello. This can be a quick answer. Wrong. That's not the US interest. Certainly, the United States and the rest of the world have moved on from the old Cold War order with the United States as the preeminent guarantor of peace and security around the world. One of the things that you mentioned, Tommy, and I've heard throughout this conference, is a reference to the great power competition. And I like to push back on the concept of a great power competition because a competition implies that all of the players are playing by the same set of rules and even that they're playing the same game. And that's not the case between the United States and China, and it's not the case between China and the rest of the free world. In 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization. 20 years on plus, it's not exactly what we had all hoped for. We gave it some time, but repeat violations by China, if not of the letter of accession to WTO, then certainly of the intent of accession to the agreement, have just been constant ever since China joined. We felt it first in the United States because our economy is far larger than the economies of other impacted countries, certainly larger than Israel's. But in the areas of things like IP theft, massive government subsidies of state-owned enterprises, market access restrictions in strategic sectors in China, required tech transfers that we heard about earlier from George, economic coercion, cyber espionage, and forced labor. These are all violations of China's accession to the World Trade Organization. So when you talk about what kind of vision does the United States have for the role that China would play in the global world order, I would simply state, play by the rules.
But moving on, I want to ask Dr. Zhao in Beijing, how does China view this relationship of the United States with its allies and partners? Is China trying to divide and rule, or is China trying to, getting through the cracks? Because I'm sure you know, President Xi is visiting as we speak Saudi Arabia, a meeting with the leaders of the Arab world. So how is China trying to deal with this? Dr. Zhao in Beijing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this very important conference. And I really wanted to apologize that I can't at this point show my face because I have a 39-degree fever right now. As you all know, that Beijing is opening up, changing its zero COVID policy. And right now, there's a huge wave coming to infect many people, hundreds of thousands of people per day right now. So I'm going through this experience that I tried, we all avoid for 3 years, but finally we have to deal with this problem. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So first of all, I listened through this conference, and I think there are many repeated points from the very beginning attacking China. And there are many misleading information, and I would say sometimes disinformation spread by the US government. And yes, I don't think that China is not sort of without mistakes or shortcomings, but surely that this is not constitute a reason or excuse for the US to launch this strategic competition with China or define US-China relations based on strategic competition. In fact, I would agree with the previous speaker that the definition from Chinese perspective of US-China relationship is not competition. And that's why also that China does not view US relations with third party, with other countries, as essentially menacing to China's foreign trade, foreign policy, or foreign affairs. So again, I think it's natural for countries to develop their individual relationship. However, it is not right or is harmful to China if that relationship is taking aim at China and aimed at China in particular. If the previous argument is correct, which means that somehow China is violating the rules, then I think it is not. There are many other countries violating the same rules, and the punishment is only aimed at China. So that gives you the exact lesson, which is that the U.S. is precisely wanted to, they have a hidden intention instead of stated obvious strategies against China. Openly or officially, they're saying they would not block China's development. However, the policies they right now are adopting, particularly policies with Israel, is aimed at China's development, particularly technology cooperations with Israel. And those are based on many distorted analysis on China's use of technology. For instance, the previous speaker talked about CFM, which is completely wrong. The understanding of the very notion of CMF is wrong, but now we don't have time to go into that. But still, I think right now to only look at security side of the trade relationship is using political or administrative power to intervene normal trading relationship, which is in itself violating the very rule of WTO. So I'll stop here and we can discuss this more later.
But I prefer not to get into this debate over WTO rules because we might lose some of the audience because from the little I've learned on trade rules, it's, well, I won't say what I think about that on my trade policy class back at the university. But Dr. Zhao, very quickly, briefly, in a sentence or two, just to follow up. So what is China going to do about this? Should Israel, for instance, fear of Chinese retaliation?
What China discovered in the past couple of years is that the US is gradually withdrawing from the global scene and shedding its responsibilities for public goods provided to global governance. And that's why China is actually providing two initiatives right now, Global Security Initiative and Global Development Initiative. And this time, President Xi is visiting the Middle East is precisely to call on countries to follow this initiative and work together on development, because there's a big hole in US foreign policy. It's only focused on security and security aspect or military aspects, and particularly in the Middle East. That's why they're losing audience in that region and in many other developing countries, which China wanted to fill in and provide infrastructure, investment, trade, and many other things that is supplemental to the current international system. Again, this is not challenging the international system or destroying the current international system.
Thank you, Dr. Zhao. We'll come back to you, but Ambassador Gold, you served as, you just recently stepped down as president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. You served as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations and as the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, you listened to the debate or discussion between an American and Chinese, and both are not in government, but very authoritative. What should Israel make of this? Should we run between the drops? Should we squirm, align, maneuver? You have a microphone over there. That's a goal. It's open. Oh.
Okay. I don't know. I don't like terms like squirm and what was it?
Align or maneuver. Those are
Align and maneuver a little more acceptable. But I think what Israel's policy should be is to defend its interests. very simply put. And, it reminds me also, a number of years ago, I was invited, a small delegation from the Jerusalem Center, to the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. And there we were in the heart of it all. And before going to the Central Committee, we stopped off at the Academy of Military Science of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. And the room was full of, I would say, colonels and brigadier generals. It's all tied in with what we're talking about.
No, put the microphone to your mouth, closer to your mouth.
Okay. Senior officers. And I remember one of the questions that was posed to us. They asked us, so whose side are you on? Are you on the side of China or the side of the United States? And I couldn't believe this question was coming, but I formulated very quickly and very tersely an answer. And the answer was, we are an ally of the United States of America. And I had no problem saying that. I didn't look around the room to see if there were people there from the U.S. Embassy who might take notes and send it to Washington. I just said what was our general guidance. And I think that has to be our general approach, whether we're sitting with 400 Chinese colonels or we're sitting, by ourselves. And that is exactly what I said when I was in Beijing, and that's what I would say here as well.
Thank you. We'll come back. James Crabtree, out in Singapore. From your point of vantage, in the middle of Southeast Asia, how are the US allies and partners dealing with this exchange?
So thank you very much for having me here. We met a couple of weeks ago, Tommy, at the IISS Manama Dialogue in Bahrain, where there were a number of senior US policymakers, both on the military and civilian side. And it was interesting to note the difference in tone that the US struck with respect to its regional partners in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, where, if I were to put it crudely, the US seemed a bit tougher on its partners in the Middle East, where the basic message given by Colin Kahl from the US State Department was, fair enough, we understand that if you're in the GCC or some of the other countries in the region, you might want to play footsie with Russia and China, but best of luck if you think they're going to contribute to your common security with respect to Iran. It had a kind of tough-edged message to it. Whereas in Southeast Asia, the US, I think, doesn't really think that any of the countries in Southeast Asia are really going to take its side against China, and therefore strikes a slightly softer tone in which it's trying to reassure about US commitment to the region and to strike a balance between pushing back against China, both in the military and economic domains on the one hand, but not being unnecessarily destabilizing on the other. I think the big difference between this administration under Biden and let's say the previous Democratic administration under Obama is that the US has slightly given up on the Southeast Asian nations as potential balances against China, and is therefore concentrating much more on a core group of allies and partners, as you put it, specifically the Quad countries, the Asian Quad, as opposed to the Middle Eastern Quad, so Australia, Japan, and to some extent India. And so that's where all of the energy is in Asia in terms of the US allies and partners. You saw some announcements this week between the US and Australia, the US and Japan, but also between the allies and partners themselves. So there's a lot of bilateral strengthening going on between, say, India and Australia, or Japan and Australia. And so that in a sense is the strategy in Asia to try and bulk up the old US hub and spoke system between its allies to create what Jake Sullivan calls a lattice work or a mesh or a web of relationships between those core allies, and to some limited degree between a couple of the Southeast Asian countries, and the hope that that will then create a balancing coalition sufficient to manage the rise of China over the medium to long term. Back to you, Tommy.
Thank you very much, James. I just want to follow up because you'll be hosting, you're the executive director of IISS Asia, and you'll be hosting in June, if I'm not mistaken, the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is the unofficial meeting of defense ministers from across Asia Pacific, or Indo-Pacific, we should now say, including the United States, including China. Do you expect, you know, it's not that far away, do you expect a different tone of the US allies and partners, you know, be it Singapore, you know, the host country, particularly, how is it maneuvering?
I mean, again, it was quite interesting going back to this meeting that we had in Bahrain a few weeks ago, how different the sort of regional meta-narratives were in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, where, I mean, this will be no surprise to anyone in your audience, but I was quite struck by the central role that the discussion over Iran played, much more prominent than the relationship between the US and China. But at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, then the US and China and that relationship has always been the absolutely central question, and everything else is either related to or secondary to that. And so I suppose I would expect that this year the tone will be reasonably similar. The relationship between the US and China has deteriorated still further since the last meeting of the dialogue last June, which was the first meeting between the US Defense Secretary and his Chinese counterpart. But since then, we've had the Pelosi visit and, in a sense, a deterioration of the situation in Ukraine, both of which have contributed to rising threat perceptions and a sense of nervousness around the region, both about the potential for military conflict in general, but in particular the trajectory between the two superpowers. So I suppose all I'd say is I hope it doesn't get that much worse. I think the tone would be reasonably similar, hopefully, in which the US and China stake out their particular positions and their red lines. I mean, I think the point that Zhao Hai just made about the way that China seeks to compete in these forums is an interesting one. You know, despite the fact that even at an event hosted in Southeast Asia, there are more participating countries in something like the Shangri-La Dialogue from the US allies and partners, simply because they're more numerous. So, you know, you have the Europeans and the Canadians and the Australians and the Japanese and the Indians. And so if you tot up the friends of the US on the one hand against the friends of China on the other, there are more major powers who are in the US side of the ledger. But as Zhao Hai says, that China, in a sense, its strategy is different. It's appealing mostly to countries in the emerging world. And there the balance is much more even. It's much more competitive. And the offer that China is making is often a very attractive one. I mean, countries in the West often don't see this because they see China as this malicious international force. But if you're in Indonesia or a country in Latin America, then, you know, China has its upsides and its downsides. It offers investment and new technology. It has a reasonably admirable model of governance, as seen from many of these countries. Sometimes it can be coercive in its diplomacy. Sometimes it doesn't play by the rules. But I think many emerging economies in Southeast Asia, in Africa and Latin America have a much more sort of on the one hand, on the other hand view of China. And that seems to me the case in the Middle East as well, you know, which is why you see countries like Saudi Arabia or the UAE trying to balance their long-term security partnership with the United States with a multifaceted economic-led relationship with China as well.
So, thank you, James. So, Bonnie, if I may, is the US happy with its allies or partners? Does it expect more from its partners and allies in terms of the China policy? Is the US communicating its concerns about China effectively? You know, we have hosted you for the past few days here in Israel. You've met Israelis in the private sector, in government. What was your impression?
Well, to be clear, I don't represent the US government. So I don't know the messaging that's currently ongoing between the United States government and its allies. But when you look at a country like Israel, and the relationship between the United States and Israel, it goes beyond government. It goes to the core of who we are as people and the shared values and the shared vision for economic growth, for democracy, and for security. When Americans come to Israel, one of the first things that they see is the startup nation and this crown jewel of Israeli diplomacy, which is really innovation diplomacy. You don't need to be a diplomat in the Israeli foreign ministry in order to represent Israel around the world. That's an extraordinary thing. And Israel is probably the only country that can say that through the innovation and through the technology and the startups that have come out of this country, Israel has been able to make a mark on the world. That's why Israel is of interest to the PRC. And Israel has always been and will always be of interest to the United States. It's not because of a thing. It's not because of the miracle of the startup nation. It's because of the miracle of Israel. So I think that when we talk to Israel as an ally, it's a very different kind of conversation than the one that we have with allies and partners in other parts of the world. As Dory said, Israel is allied with the United States. We don't worry about that in the United States. When in the Trump administration, we would talk to allies and partners, both in developed countries as well as in emerging markets, it was with an eye toward what is in the mutual security of our countries: economic security, military security, national security. And keeping that in line, I assume quite strongly that that is the same approach that officials in the Biden administration take.
Dr. Zhao, you direct international political studies with the National Institute for Global Strategy at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And I want to ask you that you mentioned now the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative as two major initiatives that you are leading, that China is leading, and the need to deal with development. Is this to say, maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you are giving up on US allies and partners and you want to focus on leading what some would call the global south? Will actually Israel not have to choose anymore?
No, that definitely doesn't mean that China is giving up any country. I think it depends on those countries' positions, whether or not they can keep some sort of distance, not succumb to US economic coercion. And I understand that Israel is a military, security ally of the United States. And in many ways, it's hard to break with the US policy towards China. However, many other countries in Europe and in Asia are also having the same problem because their position cannot be fully compatible with US security concerns. And they would not see China as a threat or a level of threat to the US level. So I think there's a great opportunity for China to develop relationship with the so-called middle power countries around the world, as long as they respect China and do business normally with China. And I think that there's no problem with that. I wanted to emphasize one thing, which is that throughout this conference, like in many other conferences like this, there's no self-reflection on the US policy or on many of the Western international order, because everything is about how wrong or how problematic China is, but never a detailed reflection or responsible reflection of what the West, or in particular the US, has done wrong in the past 20 years when the US is a monopoly power in the world and creating this so-called Pax Americana. It's not a rosy picture. It's not that the US has no flaws. And that's why, again, I want to emphasize that China is complementary in this system, not essentially a challenge to overthrow the United States. And that's why President Xi said that China and the United States can coexist peacefully in this world. And one last thing I want to emphasize, which is technology cooperation. It's not like if you cut off technology cooperation, somehow you can grow two different systems. Because if you fully understand the past 20, 30 years, the development of technology, you would know that China, United States, Israel, many other countries build a global circle, a global network to develop technology, to have investment for startups, to have China's market to test those new technologies. It's a system. Once you break that system, it's not going to come back. It's going to reduce the speed of technology innovation, and ultimately it's a lose-lose situation. And until today, the US cannot prove that Huawei technologically is a problem. They're just talking about this, but no concrete evidence. And every time we ask them for that, they just say, oh, it's because of security matter, they cannot reveal. So again, I think this shows again and again to the world this hypocrisy on the US policy. And ultimately, people will realize that cooperating with China in many respects does not pose a geopolitical threat to them. And I think that's the foundation for China developing third-party countries with relations with other countries.
Thank you, Dr. Zhao. Ambassador Gold, what would you make? Well, that happens. We heard in the previous session that it may be the case that the incoming Prime Minister Netanyahu, or I should say Prime Minister designated Netanyahu, will actually mark a shift in his approach, at least, towards China, considering it a national security issue. And I don't want to, and you're not representing Mr. Netanyahu, I won't even ask you to do so. But do you expect, or do you assess, that the next government, incoming government, will be closer to the United States in terms of its approach towards China? Or are we back to the days of that were mentioned earlier when David Schenker joined Secretary Pompeo and came in to, how would I say politely, apply certain pressure and try to convince or persuade the Israeli government to do one thing or another?
To be honest with you, it would be totally speculative of me to try and answer this.
Oh, you're allowed, you're permitted now, you know.
Yes, but I'm saying, I can't expect which way Israeli policy will shift in the future. If you even look at what will the relations be like with the Biden administration. President Biden has been a good friend of Prime Minister Netanyahu for decades. And so I could not expect that, now the Democrats are going to be facing Prime Minister Netanyahu and everything will shift. I don't believe that's the case. And I think they will try as a priority to work well together. I did want to raise one other thing, and that is something which in my visit to Beijing, I sensed very strongly. We on the Israeli side felt that we were taking positions that many times took into account Chinese sensitivities, but we failed to see a quid pro quo being given. And I'm a former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. And I remember clearly Chinese voting at the UN against the state of Israel. if we want to put our relations on a new footing, I would expect not a quid pro quo in everything, but certainly an effort to reach out to our interests and concerns, which I did not see when I was in government last time.
Last word from Singapore, and a quick one, regretfully. We also want to let you and Dr. Zhao, it's around, it's bedtime, I guess, there. US allies and partners seem to be off the hook if I listen to what Mr. Zhao, Dr. Zhao just said. Is that right, James, in your assessment?
Sorry, just rephrase the question for me. What do you ask?
I think China will not pressure US allies or partners anymore. They want to focus on the developing countries, on the global south. They're off the hook in a way.
No, I mean, I think that I understand the argument that Zhao Hai is making, which is a fair one, that the period of US hyperpower had, ups as well as downs. There was, invasions and mistakes that were made. But I think to kind of characterize China's international behavior as entirely benign and cooperative is maybe a slightly optimistic reading the other way. I mean, there are clearly many areas in which China is competing ferociously for influence, and indeed will do so much more next year than it has over the last couple of years. I mean, one of the interesting things that's going to happen next year is as China makes a welcome return to the international scene after COVID and after the Party Congress, that you'll see simply more of the usual rhythm of international diplomacy of the sort that you're seeing this week when President Xi goes to visit Saudi Arabia. And so I would expect the competition between the US and China to intensify next year. And I don't think that, there are moments in which both from the US side and the Chinese side, there's a degree of altruistic or benign international behavior, but there are also times in which it's much more of a zero-sum game. One side or the other gets to put in the telecom network or influence the political leader of the country, and so there are definitely moments in which this relationship is unmistakably competitive, and I think that will intensify over the coming year. So no, I don't think China or the US is going to get a pass. I think we're on a path in which hopefully we can avoid crisis and confrontation and military conflict, but in which the competition between the two sides, diplomatically, technologically, is going to intensify.
Well, on that not so optimistic note, our time is up. I want to wish on behalf of everyone here, I'm sure, and those joining us online, a speedy recovery, and many thanks to Dr. Zhao for joining us despite the fever and COVID. I want to thank James Crabtree joining us from Singapore. I want to thank Ambassador Gold and Ms. Bonnie Glick for joining us here in Tel Aviv. Thank you all. Julia, you're up.
Hello. We would now like to begin the next session. How will the US-China rivalry shape the Middle East? I would like to invite to the stage our next speakers, Dr. Jonathan Fulton and Dr. Peter Howard. Joining us online will be Professor Sun Dagong and Mr. Ehud Yaari.
Hello, Dr. Peter Howard serves as Senior Advisor for Regional Political Issues in the U.S. State Department and for Near East Affairs in the Office of Regional Multilateral Affairs. And he flew in for this conference, so we are extremely grateful. Jonathan Fulton is an assistant professor of international relations and political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, as well as a senior research fellow at the Atlantic Council, specializing in relations between China and the Middle East. And there are very few of us across the Middle East, so we're extremely grateful to have him here. Dr. Sun Degang, it's wonderful to see you. We met first in the summer of 2010 when you gave me a tour of Shanghai International Studies University. So
long time no see.
Been a while. He is a professor of political science now at the Institute of International Studies and the director of the Center of Middle East Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai, one of the top Middle East experts in China. He is also working on a policy level, and we are very grateful to have him with us today. And finally, also sick with COVID, but we are so grateful that you are here anyway. Old friend and outstanding correspondent, international fellow of the Washington Institute, a face you probably all recognize, award-winning Middle East commentator for Israel's Channel 12. Mr. Ehud Yaari has been a Middle East commentator for Israel television since 1975. And before COVID, he joined us in China as well. So we're very happy to have him here. By this point in the conference, you already know that China is very interested in the Middle East. And you also know that the US-China rivalry is high on the agenda for at least one Middle East country, Israel. And many in the region, though, see this rivalry as an opportunity. Speaking of which, you heard that President Xi Jinping making his first visit in 6 years to Riyadh. Professor Sun, China is a major investor in Saudi Arabia and vice versa, over $65 billion in bilateral trade. And after months of rumors that President Xi would visit, he is actually there and participating in the China Arab Summit with 14 Arab heads of state and also the China GCC conference. Is there an understanding in China that from the Saudi perspective, this could possibly not only be about doing good business, but also sending a message to the US? And what does China expect to achieve from that visit? Dr. Sun.
Thank you. First of all, would like to thank Caris and Signal for your gracious invitation. I don't think there's a zero-sum game between China and the US in the Middle East. Actually, the world is colorful, and China-US relations are different from Soviet-US Cold War. First of all, we know that now Chinese President Xi is in Riyadh. However, there's a unified market. There's no parallel market. Second, China is not spreading ideology. There's no value competition between China and the US in the Middle East. Third, China does not have military allies in the Middle East. Therefore, US should relax and should not be anxious. As early as 2016, President Xi said that China seeks 3 no's: no proxies, no sphere of influence, no filling the power vacuum left by US. Therefore, I don't think China and US are incompatible. In fact, US is seeking geopolitical influence and rivalry, while China seeks geo-economic opportunity. President Xi is in Riyadh for China Arab Summit and China GCC Summit. It's for business, it's for opportunities. It's not for enemies or rivalries or competition with US. And the fifth one is China is a developing country. China's influence in the Middle East has been exaggerated. Actually, US is a developed country, and US military allies and partners are China's economic and energy partners. China-US influence in the Middle East is asymmetric. Therefore, US is trying to weaponize its economic sanctions against China in the Middle East. And China has been demonized, but I don't think it's a problem. In the opening remarks session, I think some panelists mentioned 5G technologies of China. In fact, in China, 600 million Chinese users are using Apple phones, including my wife. I use Huawei, my wife uses Apple, there's no problem. China introduced the 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G technologies from US, which is not regarded as a threat. But all of a sudden, China's 5G technology and the companies are regarded as a threat. I cannot understand the magic, the logic behind it. I think China has offered the Middle East an opportunity, not a threat. In terms of China-Israeli relations, we know this year marks the 30th anniversary of Sino-Israeli diplomatic relations. And for China-Israel relations, I think we should avoid the impact of the third parties. China is perceived as a peer competitor of the US, which is not. While Israel is regarded as the peer rival of Iran, US is Israeli all-weather ally, while Iran has obtained the full membership at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. However, both are not liabilities. There's no concern from both sides that our bilateral relations will be harmed by the third parties of US and Iran, respectively. In my view, Israel's special relations with US and China's comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran and Saudi Arabia are not liabilities, but assets. Israel is not taking sides between China and US, and nor does China-Iran competition and cooperation target Israel. In fact, Israel can serve as a window and bridge for China-US reconciliation in the future. Meanwhile, China may serve as a bridge and play a constructive role for Israel-Iran future reconciliation. Look at the Middle East. There are 4 forces in the Middle East: the Arab countries, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. All their relations have been improved, except Israel-Iran relations. China's engagement in the Middle East is conducive to the Middle East stability, and Chinese President Xi put forward a peace initiative and security initiative in the Middle East. And the trilateral dialogue between China, US, and Israel will be conducive to the Middle East further reconciliations. Thank you so much, Charis.
Thank you, Dr. Sun. You touched on so many key topics. Perhaps, Ehud, you can respond perhaps to some of the points that Dr. Sun raised, or give us a comment about what you think is going on with respect to President Xi's visit, which was received in Saudi Arabia with so much fanfare.
Yeah, thank you, Charis. And I'm sure everybody is happy that I'm not there with you in Tel Aviv. I'll make very brief points. Number one, just compare the pomp, the trumpets, the trombones accompanying President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia today. Just compare it to the President Biden's visit to Saudi Arabia. 2 different ballgames. And I think what the president of China is trying to do now is to demonstrate how warmly he embraces the Arab world, in a minute about Iran, and how warmly the Arab world is willing to embrace China. The contrast between the Biden visit and President Xi's visit is striking. Just in passing, I will mention that in the statement put out by Beijing today, you have everything. You have quotes of sayings attributed to to Prophet Muhammad about China. You have a mention of a 2,000 years history of Chinese-Arab relations, etc., etc. It's an attempt which is welcome by many of the Arab states to create a new footing for Chinese-Arab relations. And of course, you have 3 summits. One summit with the Saudis, mainly MBS, the second with the GCC countries, and the third, an Arab-Chinese summit. So this is one point. The second point I think I should make is that the United States is not, in my humble opinion, in a hurry to depart from the Middle East. Scale down, yes. Depart, no. And China is certainly not in a hurry to take a front seat in the Middle East, in the quagmire. That is not happening now and will not happen tomorrow or in the next years to come. China is competing for presence, mainly economic presence. If China wanted to have a military foothold in the region, apart from 400 soldiers in Djibouti and few vessels in the off the coast of Somalia, I know where they would go, and they would be welcome. They would go to Eritrea, to this hermit kingdom, which would welcome them. They are not going there. They are not in a hurry, as far as I know, to go there, although they see the Americans probing about the possibility of having a naval base in Berbera, Somaliland. Somaliland, in brackets, big issue for China because of the relationship that they have woven with Taiwan, unlike any other country. The third point I think I should make is upcake. The 2019 Iranian attack on the biggest oil installations in the world. And there was no response from the United States. I think this is still with us. Never mind, it's very much on the minds of everybody in the Gulf, apart from the attacks towards Dubai and Abu Dhabi, etc. That meant for the Saudis, for example, that with the poor performance of their air force over Yemen, they are left by the United States to deal with whatever threat is posed by Iran. It's very different than both the Trump and Biden administrations and Obama before them, leaving the Israeli Air Force to confront on its own the Iranians in Syria and the Russian predator there. It's not the same. And I think the shock of the attack on Abqaiq is reflected in what is happening today and in the next 2 days. I do not believe that China is moving towards establishing an, let's call it, non-economic presence in the region. I mentioned before, they could have some options. I think mainly it is about economic foothold. And here I'm coming to the end, Caris, just to say, where is China investing? Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia. That is, Iran is not a priority. In spite of the much talked about strategic partnership agreement amounting to $400 billion. Iran is not a priority. It's very telling that in the statement put out officially by Beijing today, they mention in passing the Palestinian issue, how faithful China is to this Arab cause, but they fail to mention Iran. And they stress that China supports the stability, the independence, the territorial integrity of the Gulf states. So I'll conclude by saying that I think China has made its choice. And the choice is the Arabs come first. Iran is there, come second. Thank you.
Thank you, Ehud. I have to say, I certainly agree with your last points. Jonathan, you've been in the Gulf for over 15 years. How does this picture look from your perspective?
Pictures here, so I'm not sure which one you're talking about. I have to say, I like Ehud's point, his last point about Iran. I've been making the same point for years, and typically when I say it, two groups tend to disagree with me vociferously. They're usually the Israelis and the Americans. So thank you. I'm glad to hear it. I really think when you look at the data, the China-Iran relationship to me is more smoke than fire. There's just not much happening. And really, because I live in Abu Dhabi and I've been there since 2006 for some reason, when you look at what China's been doing with the Emiratis, with the Saudis, it is very deep, it's multifaceted, it's across a number of different types of engagement. What they do with Iran is pretty minimal, mostly rhetorical. So when you see Xi going to Riyadh this week, I've been getting countless media requests. Thankfully, Carice is keeping me busy, so I don't have to take many of them. But a lot of them have been starting with the premise that, Xi is coming to the Gulf in response to Biden's disastrous trip. And I think it was an interesting point that Ehud made that, yeah, the Biden trip compared to the Xi trip looks pretty unusual. But look at the Trump trip in 2017, that looked a lot more like the Xi trip. I think the difference being when the Saudis know they're going to get something really good, they put on a show. But again, to look at this in the context of what's happened between the US and Saudi over the short term of, say, the past year or so, this is the much more interesting story, I think. You look at the first presidential trip from China to Saudi in 1999, Jiang Zemin went and they signed a very big energy cooperation deal. And from that, they start to build on, put more meat on the bones. They start to find more ways to cooperate. When President Hu Jintao went first in 2006 and then again in 2008, every trip has led to more deeper, broader cooperation. So what we see as China coming to the Gulf and buying oil and selling cheap stuff, that narrative might have fit 20, 25 years ago. But every visit since then has deepened the relationship in a lot of meaningful ways. So again, I think with the last panel, when James was talking about the view from Singapore of the strategic competition, I think that fits in a lot with how the folks in the Gulf see it. You see this binary of you work with the US or you work with China. And I was at an event a couple of weeks ago when the former Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, Anwar Gargash, said, look, we understand that this is sensitive in Washington, but for the Emiratis, of course, the US is by far the most consequential, most important bilateral relationship. And there's no denying it. But China is also an important relationship for the Emiratis. They do a lot of stuff that for a lot of countries in the Gulf is considered also very, very important long term. I used to think the idea of strategic hedging, I wrote about this a lot years ago, saying that this looked like hedging. The problem I have with how it's being described these days in a lot of analysis is it makes it sound flimsy, like these countries are saying, we'll work with China because we're not getting what we want from the US. But if we got what we wanted from the US, then we've ditched China. And I don't think that's where they are anymore. I think that the China relationships have become much more meaningful in the Gulf. When I had talked about Iran, I think that's been a big part of it. We don't know this because nobody talks about it. The Chinese aren't very open in their messaging. But when he mentioned the attack on the Saudi Aramco, the price of oil shot up for a very short time. But that meant that the Chinese were spending $94 million a day on top of what they normally spent on buying oil.
A day.
A day. You can't convince me that somebody from Beijing didn't call somebody in Tehran and say, cut it out. You're our buddy, but I don't have any buddies that cost me $100 million a day. And I think that's an interesting thing for the GCC countries is that when they look at China, they think, here's a country that might have, I don't want to exaggerate this point, but they more than any other great power, I think they have some kind of leverage in Tehran, at least economically. I don't think that if Russia called Iran and said, don't do it, I don't think the Iranians would listen. If the US did it, they, in one ear out the other, because they're used to getting threats from Washington. But if China calls Iran and says, we're not going to support you, if that's the price tag, if you're going to hurt our relations with other important countries in the region, if you destabilize this region where we get between 40 and 50% of our energy, you're not worth it to us. And I think it's important to look at the China-Iran relationship in that context. But anyway, that's one picture. There's a whole bunch more, but I'll stop here.
I want to go to Peter and get his take on the Saudi and other issues that were raised. But if Dr. Sun, please hold the thought, because I'd love to hear your response to what Jonathan said about China's influence in Iran. Peter.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you for having me. You know, I do want to say, and I think it's been pointed out, you know, we have I think we have different approaches to the region, and it's hard to contrast the United States and its decades-long partnership with a range of countries in the region on issues of security, energy, but also education, development, people-to-people ties, right? This is a long, deep partnership with rich history that goes back many years and you know, is responsible for not just security and stability, but development and prosperity throughout the region, and also instrumental in a lot of regional conflict resolution, right? Not just in some of the countries that we've talked about, but in, you know, the whole range of the region. And, you know, you see the United States, you know, as Jonathan mentioned, right, is seen as the partner of choice. And I think that, you know, there's a good reason for that. I don't think that anyone sees that changing in the near-term future. And it's, you know, we're not looking to force a choice on any country. We're not telling a country that, you know, you can't do this or you can't do that. But I think we are making clear, you know, the stakes that we see involved. You know, we have, you know, we have, as I said, decades of working with multiple countries in the region. And, you know, these partnerships run deep because they're based on, you know, really important shared interests. In many cases, particularly here in Israel, very important shared values. You know, our commitment, you know, to work with Israel and protect Israel's security, and you know, as discussed in the last panel, this is long-lasting and a deep partnership, and it's not based on one particular commodity or an interest in a very narrow bit of security, right? The security relationship is deep, it's regional, and it's cooperative. And you know, we have focused on, you know, building cooperative security with our partners through assistance, through training, and through, you know, diplomacy across the years. So it's, I think when you're looking at that comparison, it's not the same thing. And when you're looking at, you know, one trip of the president, right, this is the culmination of years and years and reflection of years and years of partnership. And one instance is that it's not, you know, you can't say that the state of the relationship is defined by any one particular moment, right? This is a long, deep strategic partnership. And I think that we're pretty confident in the value proposition that we provide. We're pretty confident our partners are aware of the benefits of partnering with the United States. And we certainly want to make sure that, you know, all of the public is aware of that too. And that, you know, the United States is still the partner that most people in the region trust on the things that are most important to them, whether it is not just security, but also things like health. You know, where are you going to go if you have a health emergency? You know, there's a recent poll in Jordan, and most people said, well, if I had a health need, I'd travel to the United States or I'd travel to Europe. If I want to send my kid to college, you know, education and prepare my children for their future, I'm going to first look to send them to the United States. But this type of deep relationship is I think, what defines our partnership. And that's not something that, we're not seeing competition on that. That's a long-standing deep partnership. And what you see going on, you know, with the relationship today with, you know, with the Xi visit, and, you know, we'll see what comes out of that, right? We'll see what type of deals they're announced and what their communiques say and where that fits. But it's not, right? It's we have different approaches. And I think that, you know, this is, you know, gotten us to this point where our partners in the region know the value that we bring. We are clear on what we're seeking with our partners and what we want in our vision for the region. And, you know, that's built on decades of engagement and decades of partnership.
So I think we're all aware, but at the same time, as Jonathan said, the one who probably called Iran and dealt with that attack wasn't the United States. And everybody knows what happened in Afghanistan. So yes, America has its good works, but it also has its failures, its serious failures. And I think that many in the region and in the world are concerned that the United States is not the US that it was. and that it's not able to make the commitments that it did because it doesn't have the population that it did 20, 30 years ago.
I mean, the population of the US is bigger than it was.
Not size-wise, but the
Um,
direction and the way of thinking and the focus.
Yeah. No, but I think, look, we're still committed to the region. And if you look at our capacity, like our capacity to provide regional security, again, hasn't changed. Our presence here is still very robust. And, yes, you've seen the withdrawals from Afghanistan and Iraq, but the United States still maintains a very robust security and diplomatic presence in the region that is not just unmatched, but also critical to the security of the energy resources and the shipping lanes. And it's doing something that not only no one else can provide, but I think if you would talk, to most of our regional partners, they have confidence in what we bring because we're able to provide the security for global shipping lanes, air travel, and no one else is stepping into that, and no one else is seeking to step into that.
So there's no doubt. The last few lines are absolutely right. I was talking about the way that the U.S. withdrew, not just the fact that it did withdraw. But I want to go to Dr. Sun. This idea of the potential influence on Iran by China. When Dory Gold was speaking about his trip to China, he didn't mention that when we were there together, we also took him to the Central Party School, where he did a presentation on the dangers that and destabilization that Iran carries out in the Middle East, and how Israel's perspective that it is a serious threat. And the Chinese were very polite and listened seriously, but frankly, they're tired. They told us on the sidelines, they're tired of hearing it. And that was back in 2014. So is it possible that China does have this influence on Iran and can pick up the phone and make things happen?
Thank you so much, Caris. I think this is a very good point. First of all, I think China's perception of the Middle East is different from that of USA. USA seeks the Middle East from the security perspective. Who are my friends and who are my foes? Therefore, it's a kind of zero-sum game. China perceives the Middle East as a market because China believes it can seek a zero-enemy policy in the Middle East. Iran is China's very important political partner, but meanwhile, China has maintaining very nice relations with Arab countries, Israel, and Turkey. So China's perception of the Middle East is a kind of market-oriented mentality. That is, the Middle East has a population of 450 million population. Therefore, China is very, very optimistic, and US sometimes is very anxious and sensitive. I2U2 is regarded as a kind of quasi-ally, but China feels very relaxed. And China believes that we can keep good relations with all partners in the Middle East. And if, as Ehud has mentioned just now, that if you look at statistics, the major Chinese business partners are US allies. Israel, the Arab countries, GCC countries in particular. Therefore, China and the US are actually supporting the same allies. US security allies are Chinese economic allies. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Egypt, Jordan, you name it, and also Israel. So I don't think China-US competition is a fact, a matter of fact. In fact, I don't think China-US relations are competitive in the Middle East. They are cooperative very well for climate changes, for non-proliferation, and seeking common ground while putting aside difference. So President Xi's visit to Riyadh for the two summits are not targeting USA. In fact, it's helping USA having a good relations and better relations with its security allies. So for China's relations with the Middle East, I think US should support China's economic engagement because it's in the long run conducive to US. Thank you.
But you didn't respond to my question about Iran and China. But thank you. Do you want to say something on that? Is
Sure.
does China have the ability to influence on any level? And if you could just keep it brief.
I don't think China has any leverage on Iran. China-Iran is a comprehensive strategic partnership. However, China does not intervene in the internal affairs of Iran. Therefore, China's influence of Iran is very limited. To be frank, China matters only Iran's policy to China, but not its insight or its regional policies. Thank you.
Dr. Sun, I'm sorry, but I have to push back just a little bit. Iran is in the United Nations. It's a member state. And China's in the United Nations, a member of the Security Council. Iran threatens to destroy the state of Israel, which it may or may not intend to do, but it says that. And China never criticizes publicly or addresses the fact that two member states, one member is calling for the eradication of another state. Why with China, which is looking for global development, global security, promotion of peace and development around the world, why allow one country to threaten extinction of another country?
If you look at the remarks of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi when he visited the Gulf last year, he said China supports collective security and China is against aggression of all parties. I don't think he is pointing to any country, but he is against aggression of any phenomenon, any parties. I don't think China is, keeping aside. China is trying to be a mediator, but you see the Middle East security problems must be solved overall, right? Every country has its grievance, and
this is
I
not
know
a grievance.
Israel.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but that's not a grievance. Threatening the destruction of another country is not a grievance. But let's move on. And I want to ask Ehud, when you're looking at China in the Middle East, what are the key factors and issues that you think are of most interest to Israel?
I think one, are the Chinese going to become arms suppliers to potential clients in the region in view of the declining attraction of Russian weapons? Watch Vietnam diversifying away. Watch India, I assure you, will diversify away from Russian arms. So far, what I have seen, I will stand corrected, is that China was willing to assist in a limited way Ethiopia in its struggle with Tigray. Drones, not too much beyond that. So the big question to me is, will China supply Iran with its coming effort to modernize its outdated Air Force, outdated Navy, outdated tank fleet, you name it? I don't know. The second thing is we have the BRI, and I'm not going into the argument about it, but there is another, and I've been talking to you, Carice, about it before. There is another string, which is in a way in competition, and it is the organizations that you have in the East Med linked to NATO, down the Suez Canal, the Red Sea Council, initiated by Saudi Arabia, down to the IIW, the mini quad, with India, UAE, US, and Israel, and down there to the Indian Ocean, where we may see, or not, I'm coming from Australia, I don't have a good answer, where we may have some emerging quad system with a military dimension. To me, This is the major issue. Are we going to see two competitive systems coming into play over the next few years, not immediately, or not? And the third point about China in the Middle East, the way I see it, it's very, very striking that China is avoiding committing to any major moves towards reconstruction of Syria, Libya, Yemen, by the way, Afghanistan too. I think what we understand from that is that China is going for the developing relations with the established powers. And it is assisted by something which should be on the minds of everybody. That is the meltdown of Arabism, the meltdown of Arab economies, except the oil-based economies, which provides China with enormous options. See the Turkish lira. Watch the Egyptian pound, down 55% now. And I can go on and on and on. This is where they are headed. Thank you.
We heard Ehud mention the Belt and Road, Jonathan, and it's been quiet for the past 3 years on that subject, but mainly probably because of COVID. But the digital Silk Road has been rocking on, and also Iraq is the third largest recipient of Belt and Road investment. They have the oil to pay for all the construction that China is doing there. What can we expect from the Belt and Road Initiative in the Middle East, and will Chinese investment continue to grow?
You're asking a political scientist for predictions. We're no good at that. I think if you just look at the trajectory over the past however long I've been looking at this, I mean, the point Ehud just made about China's preference for working with certain countries, I think holds up. You know, if you look at the countries that have been the top 5 recipients of investment or top 5 sources of contracting, except for Iran, their US allies or partners. And I think the point of that is China's preference for stability or the status quo. I think it's easier to work with those countries, mostly because they're politically stable, and because they know that the US security arrangement makes it easy to do business there. You know, China doesn't have to worry about that stuff. So in terms of Belt and Road, yeah, I think mostly we've seen it die down, at least in the hype. Part of that is because obviously COVID, part of it was because it was already starting to cool off well before COVID. You saw Chinese overseas investment agencies were starting to cool off on a lot of these really big white elephant investment projects or infrastructure projects because they just weren't profitable. You know, so to go into, you know, Sri Lanka and fund a port and then be on the hook for it for 99 years wasn't really an attractive business model for the banks that actually have to finance this stuff. Which incidentally is a really good reason to be skeptical whenever you hear this $400 billion number associated with Iran, because that number came out of Tehran, that didn't come out of China. You look at the investments from China into Iran since 2005, and it's been less than $10 billion. The idea that they're going to plunk $400 billion into a country like Iran, you know, an isolated country that can't link up to any meaningful allies or partners, is not a very attractive market because it's always under sanctions. It's laughable to me that anybody ever use this number again. It's just insane. But it got stuck in the New York Times and everybody keeps saying 25 years, 400 billion military cooperation, and none of that stuff is real. You know, that's just hype. But in terms of Belt and Road, so yeah, we've seen fewer of those big ticket projects. They don't all make sense. But what you did see in 2015, you're right, the Digital Silk Road Initiative was announced. The Health Silk Road Initiative was announced. These things are supplementary projects to, you know, help project Chinese influence or power or, you know, engagement with other countries. A lot of it is focused on how China's gone from a very poor country to a very developed country in 40 years. And I think that's another point that James made in the previous session. When you look at China from Washington or Ottawa or from London, it's easy to say, what are you guys doing working with them? But I was talking with somebody from Algeria, and she's like, we look up to them. They were dirt poor, and now they're one of the, the second biggest economy in the world. We wanted to learn what their secret sauce is so we can kind of do the same thing. So when China's talking about these development initiatives or DSR, this stuff is very attractive. The other thing about Belt and Road is it's always been very fuzzy. It's very poorly defined. The big thing is that they said there's 5 cooperation priorities. These are the things they want to target, and not every country does it the same way. But when you saw things like infrastructure, construction cooling down, especially during COVID, what you saw was the people-to-people side of it start to increase, where they start talking with more, public health officials in China working with their counterparts in the Middle East to help them talk about tracking and tracing and doing this other stuff. And then they could say this is Belt and Road cooperation too. This fits under this people-to-people stuff, right? So I think the very vagueness of it is what makes it a pretty, successful project, because it can be anything.
Well, I'm afraid that we've run out of time. There were so many more questions that I wanted to ask, but the time is limited and we have one final speaker. So I want to thank Dr. Sun for joining us from China, Ehud from Australia, and our 2 wonderful speakers here, Peter and Jonathan. Thank you so much for a great session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry you've seen way too much of me today, but this is it. Because now we have the pièce de résistance. I am incredibly grateful and pleased to be able to invite the former ambassador to the European Union, former national security advisor, and of course, most famous for his role as the head of the Mossad. He is as wise as he is humble. He is as perceptive as he is kind, and he is a great friend, Ephraim Halevi.
I'd like to begin by thanking you for staying on. I must commend you on your patience. And in response to that, I will try and be as brief as I can and say a few things that have not been said up to now. The first comment I'd like to make is that I disagree very much with the way the great successes of China in the last few days have been described as if heralding a massive entry of China into the Middle East with all that entails. I think it must not be forgotten that this last year has been one of the most disastrous for China, not only on the medical aspect of the disease, which is still rampant there, but also in terms of international relations. The war in Ukraine began shortly after the president of China hosted the president of Russia for a meeting. And what had become very clear that at that meeting, the president of Russia did not divulge to his ally and his great supporter the fact that he was going to go to war in Ukraine. That placed China in a difficult position because China had a very, very good relationship with Ukraine. It benefited from the grain that it was receiving from Ukraine, a major contributor to food in China. When the war broke out, there were over 6,000 students from China in Kiev, in the capital of Ukraine. And the Chinese had difficulty in extricating them from there. So from that point of view, from that point on, the relationship between Russia and China was one of steep decline. Not that the relationship has come to an end, but it's a great, I think, shadow over it. When they last met, the two leaders of Russia and China, I mentioned to you that the Chinese president left Putin waiting for a day until he saw him. And apparently the discussion did not produce a desired result. The second item I'd like to mention concerning the Chinese performance over the last year or so is the fact that within just a month ago, there was an outbreak of violence in China, which was unprecedented. Many people took to the streets over the issue of COVID. And for the first time ever that I can recall in the behavior of Chinese leaders over the last few decades and decades, the leader of China took the step of changing his policy on the major issue of health. And he, whereas there was a policy of 100% no sickness, suddenly now the regulations have been eased and people are in the streets and supposedly enjoying freedom that they didn't have before. But the fact of the matter is that when the Chinese president traveled to our part of the world, he left behind him the prospects of a major outbreak of the disease again, of the Omicron item in the agenda of this disease. And if you will look at the press over the last few days concerning what China can expect in the next few weeks and months, where on the one hand, they do not have the medicine which is required to deal with this outbreak, and B, they will not have the hospital space in order to deal with the enormous number of sick people. And from the point of view of the President Xi, maybe it was a pleasant distraction to come and have this wonderful festivity, which was in his honor in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. But Saudi Arabia cannot help the president with the problem of the people of China. And how he will be able to cope with that situation is a big problem, a big issue, because China has refused over the years to take medication and medicines that have been proven extremely reliable in the West. China has developed its own solution, medical solution to the disease, and it's not working. And the prospects are that the Omicron, as I say, the Omicron item on the agenda is going to be a very, very painful one. I also believe that one has to be honest with ourselves. Israel did not at any stage always follow the line that national security is above everything. In one particular case, when the Prime Minister of Israel was about to visit China on a historic occasion, and accompanied by his wife, with his wife, of course, he was going to walk on the wall. He had initiated a court case in the United States against the Bank of China, because the Bank of China was allowing its services to be used by terrorist organizations for transfer of funds and so forth. Arab terror was not a minor item on the agenda of Prime Minister Netanyahu. It was a major item. It preceded the item of the Iranian nuclear threat. He wrote books about it. He spoke eloquently about it. And when the Chinese came to him and said to him, if you do not stop this case, your visit will not take place. Suddenly, national security stepped down and sideways, and the court case was abandoned. I'm saying this because it is a mistake to color the relationship between Israel and China as a relationship which has always been one of milk and honey. There was an attempt by the Chinese to interest the government of Israel with building a railroad from Eilat to the Mediterranean. Had this happened, this would have been a major ecological failure on behalf of Israel. And a few of us got together and campaigned against this, against the Prime Minister at the time, Mr. Netanyahu. And today, of course, he would not do this. I'm saying all this because one has to be realistic. And although I should imagine that Carice would expect me to say things which are music to your ears, I'm the one who's supposedly I'm spoiling the party. So I apologize to you, Carice, for doing this, but I'm saying the things the way that I think they are. I think the death toll in China is going to rise exponentially in the next few months. I invite you to read the New York Times in the last few days, the Economist on the last few days, two of the most, I think, important daily news sources for serious and reliable information and analysis. And you will see there that there is an expectation that there's going to be a very, very, very serious problem as a result of the turnabout by President Xi in meeting the demonstrations in the streets. That's why I believe that the question of China and the future of China today, I don't want to be the prophet of doom. China is a strong country. It's a powerful country. It's a country which has a great tradition. It's a country which has a great culture. In military areas, they were number one over the thousands of years ago. I have here the book of Sun Tzu on the art of war, which is one of the most important books which are studied by all the cadets in the American Armed Forces. I received this copy from a four-star general of the United States, General Vernon Walters of the US Air Force. He gave it to me as a parting gift when I left Washington after completing my 4-year term of duty there. So I'm not denigrating China. I think China is a great nation, and I think China is a nation with a great future, just comparable to its great past. But I think it would be wrong simply to sing the glory of China the way it was sung today without mentioning that there is these other aspects to it. I'd like to say something more about the, how should I put it, the way we in Israel look at things in black and white. Things are not black and white. And even in the Gulf, things are not black and white. It was mentioned here by people who preceded me about what China is doing in the Emirates, what China is doing elsewhere. There was one little aspect which was ignored. In Djibouti, which is on the east coast of Africa, at a very strategic position, there are 9 countries who have naval bases there. 9. Britain, France. There is a major Chinese military base in Djibouti. It's a base which has recently enlarged its docks to be able to receive aircraft carriers. It is reported that it, under the ground, deep underground, it has almost a city on its own, not where with people living there, but should there be a nuclear attack on the base. This is a base which is being built as a major base, a military base, which is very close to the Middle East. What is the purpose of this base? There's never been any clear analysis or reason given to build such a base. No other of the countries who build bases have built a base which is similar. If you send an aircraft carrier certainly far away from home, you don't send it alone. You send it with escorts, with destroyers. It's a fleet. You have American aircraft carriers in the Gulf, always in the Persian Gulf, always they have this element of support and of a whole bevy of ships that follow the main aircraft carriers. What is it in the mind, in the strategic mind of China to invest such an enormous investment in Djibouti? They've always been very active in Africa, that I can tell you, over many, many years. And they've been active there economically, and also they've been interested there in the various metals and other elements which are important there for the construction of nuclear capabilities. But why in Djibouti? And why this enormous base? No reason has ever been given. So maybe the Saudis are glorying in the fact that they were able to receive the president. And that is a question of how Saudi Arabia sees itself today. And that is not the subject of my discussions this afternoon, but also something which has to be looked at a little more seriously and with an area of doubt as to everything being so rosy as it was depicted this afternoon. I'd like to draw your attention to a book which was published last year in the United States called 2034. I don't know if any of you have read it. It's a book written by Admiral James Stavridis, who was a four-star American naval admiral, who was a former commander-in-chief of NATO. And he, together with a second writer, Elliot Ackerman, who was a very, very active officer in special operations and special activities of the American intelligence community. They described here the nuclear war which will break out in 2034. Let me read through you 3 of the quotations on the back of the book. One by Jim Mattis, who was the 26th Secretary of Defense of the United States. He says, war with China is the most dangerous scenario facing us in the world. Absent a strategic method to manage our differences, Jim Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman's chilling novel presents a realistic series of miscalculations leading to the worst consequence, a sobering, cautionary take for next time. Let me read you a second quote by Robert Gates, who was Secretary of Defense too between 2006 and 2011. He was also at one time director of the CIA. A real page turner. 2034 is a novel about a conflict we hope never happens. Drawing on their deep operational and diplomatic backgrounds, Admiral Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman have conjured a nightmare we desperately need to avoid. The novel is a cautionary tale for our times and a reminder how quickly events can spin out of control even before 2034. I wrote a critique about this book and published it in Haaretz in Hebrew. It was then translated into English. I delivered a podcast in English and in Hebrew. The podcast in English had over 100,000 people who entered it, including many tens of thousands in Southeast Asia, and also many, many people in China. As I stated, this is not, this is a novel. The name Israel is only mentioned once. But I can tell you that the incident which began this novel is an incident which took place in the Persian Gulf. And the last incident and the last item in the book is again an item of a development which ended the confrontation and which took place in the Persian Gulf. I'm saying this because I don't want to be given the role of a prophet. We know that prophecy in these days is given to fools. And I prefer not to cast myself as a fool in front of you. And I don't want to say to you that this is going to happen right this way. It won't happen this way. But I can recommend the book to you because it's very readable. But I think one of the things that we have to take into account is the question of the nuclear threat. And in that respect, I'd like to tell you of this discussion I had with a Chinese senior research authority who attended a meeting of what we call track through. That is, people who come to meetings who are people who deal with all kinds of issues internationally and so forth, and they can sit and discuss things and then produce necessary contacts that can enable the world to avoid conflict. And I spoke to the Chinese, as I said, the Chinese authority there. And I explained to him why the threat, the nuclear threat to Israel is a very, very serious threat, the nuclear threat. And this was after Prime Minister Rabin of blessed memory had information that the Chinese were giving support and aid to Iran in the field of nuclear military capability. And he came to, he traveled to China 1 year after the establishment of relations and met the president of China at the time and presented him with this information. And the president of China looked at him in the face and said, "It's not true." Well, that is an inexactitude, shall we say, on his part. I was looking for the right word. But he said to me, this Chinese, he said, "You know, we don't see the nuclear weapon as a threat to China. There's no way that they're going to destroy China. They're not going to attack China. But if the price of a barrel of oil will reach $200 per barrel, that is an existential threat to China." So you have to see things in their terms and in their context. It's important to think about these things. I believe there is enormous ground to believe that there are many people in China who are now today experiencing the way the leadership is dealing with the COVID threat, and from going from a policy to zero tolerance and closing up entire cities and so forth. They're now launching a totally different policy, a turnabout, and the streets are full of people and so forth. But if I'm not mistaken, in China too, we're approaching a few weeks of holidays and of celebrations. And what can happen then in a situation like this, where there are no sufficient medicines, not even what we have here, 3 or 4 jabs in our arms, but not even more than 1 or 2 jabs, and sometimes in many cases for many millions, not even that. That is going to be probably the subject which will necessitate the president of China to come back home and to see how he confronts the situation and how he deals with it. I have no way of advising him what to do. I am too junior in this field, and he would never turn to me. Therefore, I'm not going to try and think what the solution can be. But I want to leave you not with just with the feeling this afternoon of here the Chinese are on the hobby horse and they are galloping to a major change in the world. It is not the case. I will also say that I believe, and this is my final words, I think that the way that the President Biden is dealing with the Chinese issue in general is a very, very commendable one. I want to remind you that just a short while ago, he had a meeting with the President of China. I think it was not a physical meeting, but they spoke through a video for over 3 hours. That is a very, very encouraging thing. And given the fact that so many things have changed in the United States as well in the last few weeks, in the midterm elections, it shows that sometimes there is a common sense in the United States even greater than in Israel. So No, please. The election in Israel is over, if you haven't noticed that. And I'm not a candidate for a ministry, and there's no ministry waiting for me. Going to dole out the ministers over the weekend, and then we'll see. But this is not a time for just being humorous. It's also time to say that we must realize that we're going to enter a very difficult time in dealing with all these issues and trying to create a clear and an honest and a successful foreign and defense policy in Israel. And the fact that the Prime Minister, the incoming Prime Minister, now says that China has to be dealt differently than it was when he was Prime Minister a few years ago, that's only to his credit, because it shows that people learn to appreciate and to study their mistakes. And in this jovial manner, I say thank you very much for remaining here to listening to me and listening to things which are less commendable and less pleasant to hear. But maybe you will remember some of the things I've said, and maybe next time I'll talk at the beginning of the session, not at the end. Thank you.